Hey, my friend, settle in, get comfortable, because tonight we're headed somewhere most people think they already know, and by the end of this, you'll realize you didn't. Not really. Just a small moment before we begin. If these quiet evenings have become a bit of a habit for you, subscribing would mean more than you know, and if tonight helps carry you off to sleep, a like really does keep me going. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Maybe a small town in Texas, maybe a flat in London, maybe somewhere in the Scottish countryside where it's already raining. I read every single one, truly. All right, love. Pull the blanket up. Let's begin. We're spending tonight inside the houses of Tudor England around the 1500s, the period historians call early modern, though nobody living through it would have used a word like that. We are stepping inside the actual houses, not the ones you see in paintings, not the grand manor with its mullioned windows catching the last of the afternoon light, but the real houses, the working houses, the ones where a fire had to be coaxed into life every single morning before anything else could happen at all. And here is the detail I want to start with because it genuinely surprised me the first time I came across it, and I think it might surprise you too. Most ordinary Tudor houses, right through the middle of the 1500s, did not have a chimney. Not a small one. Not a crude one, none at all. The smoke from the cooking fire simply rose up through the room, drifted along the underside of the thatch, and found its own way out through gaps in the roof, through the eaves, through whatever opening the house happened to have. People lived, cooked, slept, and raised children inside rooms that were, by any modern standard, full of smoke for hours every single day. And they did this not because they didn't know better, but because a chimney was expensive, because brick and stone cost money that most households simply did not have, and because the whole shape of daily life had been built for centuries around a fire that sat in the middle of the floor rather than tucked away against a wall. I find that detail strangely moving, honestly. An entire world organised around smoke. Here's the part that still gets me though. That very same year, barely a day's ride away, a nobleman's household might be sitting down to supper in a hall with not one chimney but 3 or 4, each one carved from stone, each one a quiet announcement of exactly how much money that family had. To them, a room without smoke wasn't a luxury they thought about at all. It was simply the only kind of room they had ever known. 2 households, breathing 2 completely different kinds of air, under the exact same sky, in the exact same year. Let your shoulders drop an inch or 2, wherever they have been holding tension all day. Good. Now let us go back. It is not yet dawn in a small village somewhere in the middle of England. The year is around 1520, and somewhere in a low timber house, with a thatched roof, a woman is already awake in the dark, feeling along a cold hearth, with her bare hand for the shape of last night's embers. Forget the version of this scene you might be picturing, the cosy cottage, the crackling fire, the golden glow spilling across a warm kitchen. That is not what this is. This is a woman on her knees on a packed earth floor in air that is genuinely cold enough to see her breath, trying to find a single living coal among a bed of grey ash before that coal goes out completely, and she has to start the whole business of fire-making from absolute nothing. Maybe she's 30 years old, though she could not tell you the exact number with confidence, because dates and birthdays are not things most people in her position track with any precision. Maybe she has 3 children sleeping behind her on a straw pallet, tangled together for warmth under a single woolen blanket that has been mended so many times the original fabric barely shows anymore. Maybe her husband is already up and gone, out to whatever labour the season demands of him, and maybe she has, in this particular moment, roughly 4 hours of work to complete before anyone else in the household even opens their eyes. And here is the detail that sits strangely once you notice it. This woman, who owns almost nothing, who will spend her entire day in physical labour most of us would find exhausting, after an hour, is in some ways more skilled, more technically capable, more genuinely competent than most people alive today. She can start a fire with flint and steel and a wisp of dried moss in under 2 minutes, in the dark, with cold hands. She can read the colour of a flame and tell you what it means. She can bake bread in an oven with no thermometer, no dial, nothing but instinct built from 10,000 repetitions. We think of the Tudor poor as helpless, as primitive, as somehow smaller than us. They were not smaller. They were extraordinarily capable people operating inside a world that gave them almost no margin for error. The smell in that room, before the fire even catches, is worth pausing on. It is smoke, old smoke, soaked permanently into the timber beams overhead, and the woven wattle and daub walls mixed with the animal smell of wool bedding, and underneath all of it, faintly, the packed earth floor itself, slightly damp, slightly mineral. There is no glass in the small window opening, just a wooden shutter that has been pulled closed against the night air, and even closed it lets in threads of cold that move across the room like something alive. The sound when it comes is small, a scrape of flint against steel, a pause, another scrape, then the tiny, almost inaudible catch of a spark meeting dried moss, and a thread of smoke rising in the dark before there is any visible flame at all. This is 4 a.m. in Tudor England, and it will be repeated in one form or another in nearly every house in the country, every single day for the entire century. This coal she finds is small, barely the size of a fingernail, glowing a dull orange that could die at any moment if she breathes wrong or moves too fast. She feeds it slowly. First, a handful of dried grass, gathered and saved specifically for this purpose, tucked into a dry corner near the hearth weeks ago. Then thin twigs, no thicker than a pencil, arranged in a loose little tent the way her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her, going back further than anyone in the family could actually trace. She blows on it, gently, a long, slow breath rather than a sharp one, because a sharp breath can scatter the coal rather than feed it. This is a skill. Nobody in this house would call it a skill. It is simply what a morning is. That fire sits not against a wall, but in the centre of the main room, on a raised hearth of packed clay and stone that has been built up over years, replastered whenever it cracks. This is the detail worth sitting with. There is no chimney breast, no flue, no engineered channel for smoke at all. The room has what people at the time sometimes called a smoke bay, a kind of open framework near the roofline designed to gather smoke and encourage it upward and outward, but it is a rough solution at best. On a still morning, with no wind to help pull the smoke along, the room fills, not with the thin decorative wisps you might picture, with genuine haze, grey and stinging, thick enough that the far wall becomes indistinct, thick enough that her eyes water and her throat catches before she has even finished feeding the flames their first proper log. And she has learned to live inside that haze the way a person learns to live inside anything repeated often enough. She works low, near the floor, where the air stays marginally clearer for longer. She has learned to time her breathing, shallow and quick during the worst of the smoke, deeper once the fire settles into a steady burn, and the smoke thins from a wall into something more like a lazy drifting layer near the ceiling. Her children, when they wake, will cough for the first few minutes of every single day of their lives, and nobody in this house considers that unusual, because it has never once been anything other than normal. We know now, looking back with everything we understand about lungs and smoke, and the slow accumulation of damage over decades, that this daily exposure almost genuinely shortened lives, worsened chest complaints, thickened coughs into something more serious as people aged. They did not know that. Or rather, they knew something was true about smoke and health in a vague, practical way, the way you know a stinging thing is probably not good for you, without the deeper mechanism ever being visible to them. Once the fire is burning steadily, her first real task begins, and it is one that modern kitchens have made almost invisible to us, so ordinary now that we forget it was ever difficult. Water. There is no tap in this house. There will not be a tap in most English houses for another 3 centuries at least. Water comes from a well at the edge of the village, or from a stream if the village is built near one, and it comes in buckets, carried by hand, across whatever distance separates the house from the source. On an ordinary morning she'll make this trip perhaps 4 or 5 times, each bucket weighing close to 20 pounds once filled, the yoke across her shoulders if the household owns one, or simply her 2 arms if it does not. That is somewhere near 80 or 100 pounds of water carried by hand before the sun has properly risen, not counting anything else the day will ask of her. Let us slow down here for a moment and actually sit with what that means, because it is easy to hear a number like that and let it slide past without really landing. 100 pounds of water every single morning, rain or frost or mud underfoot, it does not matter. The water still has to come from wherever it comes from and arrive at the hearth in time for the porridge to start, for the bread to be mixed, for the animals to be watered if the household keeps any. Her hands, by the time she is 40, will be permanently roughened in a way that would look almost shocking to us now. Knuckles swollen from cold water and repeated strain, palms calloused thick enough that a splinter barely registers. This is not a detail meant to horrify you. It is simply the texture of an ordinary life, and I think there is something worth admiring in it. Honestly, a kind of quiet, unglamorous endurance that we rarely think to celebrate because it left no monuments behind, no paintings, nothing but bone evidence in graves that archaeologists still study today. Breakfast, when it comes, is not what you might picture either. Forget bacon and eggs, forget anything resembling a modern English breakfast, which is itself mostly an invention of a much later century. In this household, breakfast is most likely a pottage, a thick soup or porridge built from whatever grain the family can afford, oats most commonly among the poorer households, barley or a mixture of grains among those slightly better off, cooked slowly in a pot suspended over the fire on an iron hook, or set directly among the coals depending on the equipment the household owns. Into this pottage might go whatever vegetables are in season and available: onions, leeks, perhaps a little cabbage, and if the household is fortunate enough to have any, a small amount of salted or smoked meat, more for flavour than for substance, because meat in any real quantity is a luxury this family sees only rarely, at feast days, at particular points in the agricultural calendar, when a pig might finally be slaughtered. The bread, if there is bread this morning rather than only pottage, tells its own story about status and struggle. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour, is for the wealthy. This household eats what is sometimes called maslin bread, a mixture of wheat and rye, or in leaner households and leaner years, bread made substantially from barley, or even, in the very worst seasons, bread stretched with ground peas or beans to make the flour go further. The texture is dense, coarse, almost grey in colour compared to the bright white loaves you would find on a nobleman's table. It fills the stomach. It does not particularly please the palate, and nobody in this house expects it to. Food, for most people in Tudor England, exists primarily to keep the body working through another day of labour. Pleasure, when it arrives at the table, is a secondary and occasional guest. Now let us leave this hearth for a moment, though we will return to it, because I want you to hold this image in your mind while we step somewhere entirely different. I want you to remember the smoke, the cold water, the coarse bread, because in about a quarter-mile away, sometimes closer, sometimes further, depending on the particular village, there might stand a manor house. And inside that manor house, at this exact same hour, on this exact same cold morning, a very different kind of fire is being built by a very different kind of hand, though the person building it is doing so for someone else entirely. But before we cross that distance, there is more to see in this smaller house, because the morning has barely begun. Once the pottage is started and left to simmer slowly, our woman turns to the tasks that will occupy most of her daylight hours, and cleaning, in a Tudor household, is nothing like what the word suggests to us now. There is no soap sitting conveniently in a bottle by the sink. Soap, if the household uses any at all, is often made at home, a harsh, strong-smelling substance rendered from animal fat and wood ash lye, a process that takes days and produces something closer to a chemical burn risk than a gentle cleanser. For most everyday scrubbing, plain water and a stiff brush made of natural bristles does the work, along with a considerable amount of the substance most valuable to any Tudor household attempting cleanliness, which is simply effort. The floor beneath her feet is packed earth, sometimes mixed with a binding agent like ox blood or clay to give it more stability, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw that get changed out periodically, though periodically in this context might mean once every few weeks rather than daily, Sweeping this floor does not produce the crisp, satisfying cleanliness of sweeping a modern tile floor. It produces a slightly better arranged version of dirt, because the floor itself is, in a sense, made of dirt. She sweeps anyway every morning, because a floor left entirely untended becomes a floor that attracts vermin, and vermin in a Tudor house is not an abstract inconvenience. Rats and mice mean disease, mean grain stores raided and ruined, mean a threat that this household understands intuitively even without the germ theory of disease that would not arrive for centuries yet. Laundry deserves its own particular mention, because if you think the water carrying sounds difficult, laundry compounds that difficulty many times over. Clothes in this era are not washed weekly the way we might expect. For most households, a full laundry day happens perhaps once a month, sometimes even less frequently, and when it happens it is genuinely an all-day undertaking, sometimes drawing in help from neighbours or female relatives because the labour is simply too much for one pair of hands. Linens and clothing are soaked, then scrubbed against a washing board or simply against stones at the water's edge if the household washes at a stream, then often left to soak in a mixture of water and lye or stale urine, which was a genuinely common laundry additive of the period, because its ammonia content helped cut through grease and grime in ways plain water could not manage. I know that detail sounds strange, maybe even a little unpleasant, and I understand if you wrinkle your nose at it, but it is true, and it tells you something real about how resourceful this world had to be, using whatever was available, however unglamorous, because nothing came from a store shelf with a pleasant scent already built in. After the scrubbing comes the wringing, done entirely by hand, twisting heavy wet fabric until the arms ache, and then the laying out, draped over hedges or bushes or hung across ropes strung between the house and whatever tree or post stood nearby, left to dry in whatever weather the sky happened to provide that day, which in England is a genuinely unreliable partner for a laundry schedule. A sudden rain could undo an entire day's labour in minutes, and there was no complaint department, no do-over. You simply began again another day, whenever the weather and the schedule allowed it. Between the fire tending and the water carrying and the sweeping and the endless small maintenance of a household that owns almost nothing but must still be kept functioning, there is the cooking itself, which continues throughout the day, rather than concentrating into 3 discrete meals the way we imagine now. The midday meal, sometimes called dinner in this period's terminology, which can confuse modern ears expecting dinner to mean an evening meal, is typically the largest meal of the day, eaten sometime around noon when the sun is highest and the morning's labour has built a genuine appetite. This meal might include the same pottage from breakfast, perhaps thickened further or supplemented with whatever additional ingredients the day allowed, along with bread, and if the household is fortunate, a small piece of cheese or a few eggs from whatever hens they keep. Meat appears on this table rarely, and when it does, almost nothing goes to waste. A pig slaughtered in autumn provides not just the obvious cuts but blood for pudding, fat rendered for cooking and for candles, skin used or eaten, bones boiled down for every last trace of nutrition they can surrender. This is not thrift as a virtue chosen from a range of options. It is thrift as the only option available, the difference between enough food to survive the winter and not quite enough. I find myself genuinely admiring the precision of it, honestly, the way absolutely nothing goes unused, when you consider how much modern households discard without a second thought. The afternoon brings its own tasks, seasonal and specific. In spring there might be a garden to tend, a small plot behind or beside the house where cabbages and onions and herbs grow, tended by hand with simple tools, weeded constantly because weeds compete with food crops for the same limited soil and the same limited rain. In autumn there is preserving to think about, salting meat, drying herbs, storing grain in whatever containers keep it safest from damp and vermin, because the household's survival through the coming winter depends entirely on how well this preservation work gets done in these particular weeks. There is no refrigeration, no freezer, no way to simply buy more food if the stores run short in February. What gets preserved now is, quite literally, what the family eats until spring returns. And through all of this, there is the constant tending of the fire itself, because letting it go out entirely means starting the whole difficult process again from flint and steel, and every household tries to avoid that if at all possible. The fire is banked at night, covered carefully with ash to keep a coal alive until morning. A technique passed down through generations because a household that can keep a single coal alive through 8 hours of darkness saves itself enormous labor the next day. Sometimes it works. Sometimes, despite every care, the coal dies anyway, and the whole cycle begins again in the cold dark of a new morning, exactly as it did today. Now let us walk that quarter mile, past the hedgerows still dark with night, past a sleeping village where a few other chimneyless houses are just beginning to show their own thin drifts of smoke rising against the pale early sky, and let us step through the gate of the manor house, because the fire being built here at this same early hour tells an almost completely different story, even though it is, underneath everything, still just a fire. The house itself announces its difference before you even reach the door. Timber framed still because brick construction remains expensive and somewhat unusual even for the wealthy in the earlier decades of this century, but built taller, built wider, with genuine glazed windows in the hall, small diamond-shaped panes held together with strips of lead, catching what little morning light exists and turning it into something with actual color and texture, rather than the flat grey dimness of a shuttered cottage window. And here is the detail that matters most. Rising unmistakably from one end of the roofline, there is a chimney, brick-built, tall, with a proper flue drawing smoke up and away in a controlled column rather than letting it wander loose through the rafters. This single architectural feature changes almost everything about how the household experiences fire, warmth, and the simple act of breathing indoors. A chimney was, in the 1500s, a genuine status marker, almost as significant in its own way as the clothes a family wore or the number of servants they employed. To have a chimney meant you had the money for skilled masons, for proper brick, for a structure engineered correctly enough not to catch the entire house alight, which was a real and constant danger with poorly built early chimneys. It meant your household's smoke, unlike the smoke in the cottage we just left, actually went somewhere, pulled upward by the physics of a well-drawn flue, rather than lingering to sting the eyes of everyone gathered near the hearth. But someone still has to build that fire, and this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because the person doing it here is not the lady of the house. She is asleep still, in a bedchamber several rooms away, under blankets and a coverlet that would represent more fabric and more labour than this entire cottage family's wardrobe combined. The person crouched at this hearth in the cold dark is a servant, likely a young woman, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, who has been up even earlier than the cottage woman we just left, because a household of this size and status has fires to build not just in the main hall, but potentially in several rooms, and the work must be finished before the family wakes and expects warmth to already be waiting for them. Maybe her name does not survive in any record anywhere, which is true for the overwhelming majority of servants from this period. Maybe she came from a family not unlike the one in the cottage, sent into service at 12 or 13 because her own household had one less mouth to feed and one more small wage coming in if she found a position. Maybe she sleeps in a narrow truckle bed in a room off the kitchen, sharing that space with 2 or 3 other female servants, and maybe she has already been awake for the better part of an hour before this moment, because the kitchen fire, the largest and most demanding fire in the entire house, needed tending even earlier than the hall fire she is building now. And here is the paradox worth sitting with, the one that runs underneath this entire comparison. This household has more wealth, more comfort, more genuine architectural sophistication than the cottage we just left by an enormous margin, and yet the actual physical labour of creating warmth, of building fires, of hauling water and fuel, has not disappeared at all. It has simply been transferred onto someone else's body, someone whose name history mostly declined to record, Someone who rises earlier and works longer precisely so that another person, the lady of this house, need never once in her entire life feel a cold hearth under her bare hand in the dark. Wealth in Tudor England did not eliminate hard physical labour from a household. It relocated it. Let us follow this young servant a little further, because the kitchen she came from before building the hall fire is worth entering properly. A manor house kitchen in this period is nothing like the cottage hearth we spent our first half hour beside. It is often housed in a separate building entirely, detached from the main house because the fire risk from such intense, constant cooking was considered too dangerous to keep directly connected to the family's living quarters. Inside, there is not one fire but several, arranged around a room large enough to feel almost cavernous compared to the cottage's single small chamber. A great open hearth dominates one wall, wide enough to roast an entire side of meat on an iron spit turned by hand, or in the wealthiest households, turned by a small dog trained to run inside a wheel connected to the spit mechanism, a detail that always makes me smile a little because it is so unexpectedly practical and so strange to picture now. The kitchen staff itself operates almost like its own small society, with a hierarchy as clearly understood as any noble household's ranking of lords and ladies. At the top sits the cook, sometimes simply called the master cook, a position of genuine skill and, in the largest households, genuine respect, commanding wages that could exceed what many skilled tradesmen earned elsewhere. Below the cook, various assistants handle specific responsibilities, a person dedicated to the bread ovens, another to the roasting fires, another to sauces and the more delicate preparations that required a steadier and more practiced hand. Scullions, the lowest-ranked kitchen workers, often young like our fire-building servant, handle the unglamorous tasks, scrubbing pots, plucking birds, hauling the truly staggering quantities of water and fuel a kitchen this size demands every single day, and the quantities involved genuinely are staggering, especially once you start comparing them against what we saw in the cottage, where our first household might see meat perhaps once a week, and often less. A wealthy manor's kitchen could be processing multiple animals in a single day during periods of heavy entertaining. Records from great households of the period, when they survive, show numbers that seem almost fictional against the backdrop of the cottage's careful, thrifty pottage. A single feast might call for dozens of birds, several whole sheep or a side of beef, gallons upon gallons of ale, and an array of spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, that would have cost more in a single meal's seasoning than the cottage family's entire yearly income. Spices actually deserve a moment of their own attention here, because they tell you almost everything you need to know about the gap between these two households. In the cottage, flavour comes from what grows nearby, from onions and garden herbs and whatever wild plants a person learns to recognise and gather safely. In the manor kitchen, flavour arrives from thousands of miles away, carried by ship and then by cart, taxed and traded and marked up at every stage of a journey that stretched from places like the Spice Islands of what we now call Indonesia, through Venetian and other merchant hands, across the width of Europe, before finally arriving in an English kitchen as a small, precious, carefully guarded quantity, often locked away and controlled personally by the lady of the house or a trusted steward, because spices were valuable enough to steal. The bread here tells its own contrasting story too, where the cottage baked coarse maslin loaves stretched with rye or barley, the manor's kitchen produces manchette, a fine white bread made from carefully sifted wheat flour, the bran removed as thoroughly as the milling technology of the period allowed, producing a loaf pale and soft compared to the dense grey bread eaten a quarter-mile away. This bread, along with a coarser secondary loaf called cheat bread, would be baked in quantities that reflect not just the family's needs but the needs of the entire household staff, because everyone eats, from the lord at the high table down to the youngest scullion, though what they eat and how much varies considerably depending on rank, a detail Tudor households took extremely seriously and codified with real precision in household ordinances that survive to this day in various archives. I want to pause here on something that genuinely surprised me while thinking through this comparison, which is that the servants in a household like this, while surely working hard, often ate considerably better than the poorest independent cottagers outside the manor's walls. A position in service, however demanding, however early the mornings and late the nights, guaranteed food, guaranteed shelter, guaranteed a kind of security that the precarious cottage economy simply could not promise. This is not meant to romanticize service, which came with its own real hardships, long hours, limited freedom, a rigid hierarchy that could be cruel depending entirely on the particular household and the particular master or mistress. But it complicates the simple picture we might otherwise assume. The idea that everyone outside the manor walls was equally poor and everyone inside was equally comfortable. The truth sits in a messier, more interesting middle ground. Let us move further into the manor now, because while the kitchen fire and the hall fire are being built, another kind of morning is unfolding upstairs, one that mirrors the cottage's rhythms in shape while diverging completely in texture. The lady of this house, let us imagine her called Isabel, wakes not to the sound of her own hands striking flint against steel, but to the quiet entrance of a body servant, a woman perhaps a little older than the fire tender we just met, whose entire function within the household revolves around Isabel's person, her dressing, her hair, her comfort. Isabel does not rise into cold air the way the cottage woman did. Not exactly, because by the time she wakes, a fire has already been burning in her chamber for some while, banked carefully through the night and built up again before dawn specifically so that the room holds at least some warmth by the hour she opens her eyes. This is, I think, one of the clearest single measures of the gap between these two lives. Warmth itself, something the cottage family fights for every single morning with cold hands and aching backs, arrives here already prepared, already waiting, the product of someone else's earlier labor rendered invisible by the time Isabel actually experiences it. Dressing, for a woman of Isabel's rank, is its own considerable undertaking, though nothing yet approaching the elaborate multi-hour productions that would develop in later Tudor decades and reach their true extremity under Elizabeth. Still, there are layers to manage. A linen smock worn against the skin, chosen partly for comfort and partly because linen could be washed more easily than the outer garments, protecting the more expensive fabric layered above it from direct contact with sweat and skin oils. Over this, stays or a simple bodice depending on the exact decade and fashion, stiffened enough to shape the torso into the fashionable silhouette of the period, though considerably less rigid than the engineering marvels that later corsetry would become. Then a kirtle, a petticoat, an overgown in whatever fabric and colour Isabel's household can afford, wool for everyday wear, perhaps a finer worsted or even silk for occasions that call for it. Her servant laces and pins and adjusts, a process that takes perhaps 20 or 30 minutes for an ordinary day, considerably longer if the day ahead includes visitors or any kind of formal occasion. And throughout this process there is conversation, or there can be depending on the particular relationship between mistress and servant, which varied enormously from household to household. Some ladies treated their body servants with genuine warmth, near companionship built from years of shared intimate routine. Others maintained a strict, cool distance, treating the servant as functionally invisible, despite the physical closeness the role demanded. We do not know for any specific pairing exactly where on that spectrum they fell, though household letters and occasional diary fragments that survive from later in the century suggest the warmer end of that spectrum was not uncommon. Hair comes next, and here again the contrast with the cottage sharpens considerably. Isabel's hair is likely covered for most of the day regardless of how it is arranged underneath, because a married woman of any social standing in this period covers her hair in public, a custom rooted in both practicality and modesty that persists across most of the century in various forms. Gable hoods in the earlier decades giving way gradually to French hoods and other styles as fashion shifted. Underneath whatever covering the day calls for, her hair still needs brushing, arranging, pinning, work that the cottage woman who covers her own hair with a simple coif for entirely practical reasons rather than fashionable ones, performs for herself in a fraction of the time, with a fraction of the ceremony. Washing for Isabel involves water carried up by yet another servant, warmed over yet another fire, poured into a basin considerably finer than the cottage's simple pottery, sometimes pewter or even silver in the wealthiest households, though full immersion bathing remains rare and somewhat suspect throughout this period for people of every social rank, tied to genuine medical beliefs of the time, suggesting that hot water opened the pores and left the body dangerously vulnerable to disease and bad air. This detail always strikes me as worth remembering, because it means the enormous gap in comfort and resources between these two households did not translate into an equally enormous gap in actual bathing frequency. Neither Isabel nor the cottage woman is bathing daily in the way we would now consider normal. Both rely primarily on washing exposed skin, on clean linen changed regularly against the body, on the belief, shared across the entire social spectrum of this century, that clean linen did more genuine hygienic work than water itself. Once dressed, Isabel's morning moves toward the hall, where breakfast, again called by that name though eaten earlier and lighter than the midday dinner that will follow, might consist of bread and perhaps a small amount of meat or fish depending on the day of the week and whatever religious calendar obligations apply. Washed down with small beer, a low-alcohol brew that served in this period much the same function water serves for us now, because actual water quality was often uncertain enough that beer brewed and therefore boiled at some stage in its production represented in practice a genuinely safer everyday drink for people of every social class. I find that detail almost funny in a quiet way, honestly. The idea that both the poorest cottager and the wealthiest lady of the manor were in their own ways drinking beer for breakfast, though the quality and strength of that beer would have differed enormously between the two households. The hall itself where this breakfast happens deserves a moment of description, because it is the true heart of a Tudor manor house in a way that has no exact modern equivalent. High-ceilinged, often open to the roof timbers above, warmed by that great chimney we noticed on our way in, hung with tapestries if the family can afford them, both for decoration and for the very practical purpose of insulation, because tapestries genuinely do trap warmth against stone or timber walls in ways that bare surfaces cannot manage. Long tables, trestle-built so they can be disassembled and cleared when the hall needs to serve other purposes, run down the room's length, and here the household's entire hierarchy sits down together in a manner that might surprise people expecting a strict separation between family and staff. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates our usual mental picture of Tudor social division. In earlier decades of the century especially, before the great houses shifted toward the more private arrangements that would dominate later, the lord and lady of the house, their children, their most senior servants, and their lowest-ranked staff might all eat within the same hall, at the same time, though never at the same table and never eating quite the same food. The lord's family sits at the high table, elevated slightly, often on a raised platform called a dais, served first and served the finest dishes. The senior household officers, the steward, the cook, perhaps a trusted secretary or chaplain if the household is grand enough to employ one, sit at a table below but still within clear sight of the family, and the lowest servants, our fire-tending girl among them, eat further down still, plainer food, simpler portions, but food nonetheless, and food that arrives with a consistency the cottage family outside these walls could never quite guarantee for themselves. Let us think now about cleaning within the manor, because it is tempting to assume that greater wealth simply means greater cleanliness arrives automatically, and that assumption does not entirely hold up once you look closely. A house this size, with this many rooms, this many people passing through it daily, this much rush-strewn or woven matting covering its floors, actually presents a cleaning challenge in some ways more complex than the cottage's single small room, even though the manor has far more hands available to meet that challenge. Floors throughout much of the house, even in fairly grand rooms, are often still covered with rushes or reeds laid down in a thick layer, refreshed periodically by servants who gather fresh material, strew it across the old, and periodically clear out the whole accumulated layer when it becomes too soiled or too infested with whatever crumbs and small vermin inevitably work their way into any material spread across a floor and left for weeks at a time. This detail always surprises people, I think, because we tend to picture a grand Tudor hall with polished stone or wood underfoot, and in the very wealthiest and latest houses of the century, that picture becomes more accurate. But for much of the 1500s, rush-strewn floors remain common even in genuinely impressive houses, and the smell those floors produce, especially in the weeks before a fresh strewing, would strike a modern visitor as startlingly unpleasant. A mixture of dust and old food, and whatever the household's dogs, which often had free run of the hall, contributed to the mix. Laundry, though, is where the manor's greater resources show most clearly, where the cottage manages an exhausting monthly laundry day handled almost entirely by the lady of the house herself. A manor of any real size employs dedicated laundresses, women whose entire function within the household revolves around washing, a specialization that the cottage's more limited household simply cannot support. These laundresses work in a space set apart from the main house, often near a stream or a dedicated water source, boiling linens in great cauldrons, working lye and soap through fabric with the same twisting, wringing, exhausting physical labor the cottage woman performs alone, except distributed across several pairs of hands and, more importantly, performed as a person's actual specialized occupation rather than squeezed in around 100 other daily demands. The sheer volume of linen a household like this generates is worth pausing on too. Every bed needs sheets, and a house with multiple bedchambers for family and honored guests, plus separate sleeping arrangements for the senior staff, multiplies the linen needs many times beyond a single cottage bed's simple woolen blanket. Table linens for the hall, considerable quantities of them used at every meal and changed regularly enough to maintain the appearance the family's status demands. The undergarments and shirts of every family member and every senior servant, all of it passes through the laundress's hands on a rotating schedule that, unlike the cottage's monthly ordeal, might see different categories of linen washed on different days throughout the week, spreading the labor more evenly even as the total quantity dwarfs anything the smaller household ever handles. And here, once again, the paradox from earlier returns in a slightly different shape. Isabel herself, almost without question, does not know, in any detailed practical sense, how lye soap is made, how long linen needs to soak, how hard the wringing truly is on a person's hands and shoulders after an entire day of it. She experiences clean linen the way most of us now experience clean laundry, as a simple fact of daily life rather than a process demanding hours of someone else's genuine physical suffering. The gap between the cottage and the manor is not in the end a gap between hard labor and no labor. It is a gap between labor experienced directly and labor experienced only through its finished, invisible result. Midday brings the day's most substantial meal to both households, and here the contrast in scale becomes almost impossible to overstate. In the cottage, dinner remains the pottage we described earlier, perhaps supplemented now with whatever the morning's garden work or foraging produced, eaten quickly without ceremony, because there is more work waiting immediately afterward, and no real tradition of lingering over a meal when daylight hours are this precious and this limited. The family, if they eat together at all rather than in staggered shifts around each person's separate tasks, sits on simple stools or benches around a rough table, eating from wooden trenchers which are, worth noting, not plates in the modern sense, but flat pieces of wood, sometimes simply stale bread cut into a bowl shape, that soak up the pottage's liquid and can themselves be eaten afterward, or in leaner circumstances, given to animals or saved for the next meal. In the manor's hall, midday dinner becomes something closer to genuine theatre. Multiple courses arrive in sequence, each course itself often containing several separate dishes presented together rather than the single course, single dish structure we might expect from that word today. A typical dinner for the family and honoured guests might open with a course featuring boiled meats and a pottage of its own, considerably richer than the cottager's version, thickened with bread or ground almonds, flavoured with those expensive imported spices we discussed earlier. A second course might bring roasted meats, birds especially favoured for their visual impressiveness as much as their flavour. Swans and peacocks appearing at the very grandest tables specifically because their rarity and difficulty of preparation communicated wealth as clearly as any words could. A final course often brought sweeter dishes, fruit preserved in sugar, another substance so expensive during this period that it functioned almost as a spice itself rather than the everyday sweetener it would later become, along with elaborate confections that the kitchen staff might spend considerable time and skill constructing purely for visual impact. The serving of this meal involves its own elaborate choreography. Household servants, dressed appropriately for their role, carry dishes from the kitchen through connecting passages or across an open yard depending on the house's specific layout, timing their arrival so that food reaches the table at something approaching the correct temperature despite the physical distance between kitchen and hall. A carver, often a position of some genuine skill and status within the household, manages the cutting and portioning of meats at the table itself, following an elaborate set of conventions about which cuts and portions go to which diners based on rank, conventions detailed enough that instructional texts on proper carving actually circulated among households wanting to get this performance correct. And throughout this entire elaborate meal, somewhere back in that detached kitchen building, the scullions and lower kitchen staff are eating their own considerably plainer dinner, in whatever brief window the ongoing demands of the meal's preparation and cleanup allow them. Food that, while simpler than what reaches the high table, still represents more reliable and consistent nourishment than the cottage family, a quarter-mile away, can generally guarantee for themselves through every season of every year. Afternoon in the cottage shifts the day's rhythm without ever really slowing it down. Once the midday meal is cleared, which mostly means the wooden trenchers wiped clean and set aside rather than any elaborate washing up, our woman turns to whatever the season and the particular week demands of her. Textile work occupies an enormous portion of these afternoon hours, more than almost any other single category of labour across a Tudor woman's year. And it is worth understanding why, because clothing in this period does not simply appear from a shop the way it does for us now. If the household keeps sheep, and many cottage households did keep at least a few, wool must be washed, carded, spun into thread using a simple drop spindle or, in wealthier cottages, a spinning wheel, before it can become anything wearable at all. Spinning especially consumed enormous quantities of time, done in every spare moment a woman could find, while walking, while minding children, while sitting near the fire in the day's last hour of light, because a single person spinning by hand produces thread slowly enough that clothing an entire family required near constant production simply to keep pace with wear and tear and growing children who outgrow garments faster than any household can easily replace them. This is incidentally where our modern word spinster comes from. A woman who spins because unmarried women often supported themselves through exactly this kind of textile labour, sold or traded to households needing more thread than their own women could produce alone. Once thread exists, it must be woven into cloth, a process that in most cottage households happens not at home but through a local weaver, someone in the village or a nearby settlement who owns a loom and possesses the particular skill weaving demands. Paid in coin if the household has any to spare, or more often through barter, thread or labour exchanged directly for finished cloth. And once cloth exists, it still must be cut and sewn into actual garments, work that happens entirely by hand, every stitch placed individually with a needle that the household guards carefully, because a lost or broken needle represents a genuine, meaningful loss, when replacement means a trip to buy another from a travelling peddler or a market town possibly miles away. Children in this household are not idle observers of any of this. From a remarkably young age, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, they are drawn into whatever tasks match their size and capability. A small child might be set to watching younger siblings, or scaring birds away from the garden's growing vegetables, or gathering kindling from the hedgerows and woodland edges nearby. By 8 or 9, real productive labour begins in earnest, spinning their own small quantities of thread, helping with animal care, learning the particular skills their gender and family's trade will require of them for the rest of their lives. There is very little that we would now recognise as childhood in the sense of a protected period free from labour. Play existed, no doubt, snatches of it, games with simple homemade toys, but it existed alongside work rather than instead of it, woven through the same days that demanded genuine contribution from even quite young hands. Illness, when it arrives in this household, is met with a body of practical knowledge passed down through generations of women, a kind of folk medicine built from observation and tradition rather than anything resembling what we would now call clinical evidence, though it was not therefore useless, and some of it we now understand worked for genuine, traceable biological reasons even though the people using it could not have explained why. Herbs gathered from the garden or the surrounding countryside treated everything from fevers to wounds to the endless minor complaints of a physically demanding life. Feverfew for headaches, comfrey, sometimes called knitbone, packed against breaks and sprains because it genuinely does seem to encourage bone and tissue healing, a property modern research has actually confirmed in certain applications. Yarrow to help stop bleeding from cuts, which modern understanding suggests does have some real astringent properties, supporting that traditional use. But alongside these genuinely functional remedies sat treatments we would now recognize as having no real medical basis at all. Charms and prayers said over wounds, the belief that certain ailments responded to being touched by a person of particular status, the widespread practice of bloodletting for conditions where we now understand it likely did active harm rather than help. Nobody in this household, or almost anybody in England at this time, regardless of wealth, possessed the framework to distinguish reliably between the remedies that worked and the ones that did not, because that framework, the systematic testing and comparison we now call medical science, simply did not exist yet in any form that would be recognizable to us. A physician's actual medical training, available only to the wealthy who could afford to consult one, drew on humoral theory, the ancient idea that health depended on a proper balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, a framework that guided treatment decisions but that we now understand had essentially no genuine correspondence to how the human body actually functions. The Manor's afternoon unfolds along entirely different lines, though it would be a mistake to imagine Isabel's hours as simply idle or decorative, because a household of this size and complexity requires genuine management, and that management fell, in practice, largely to the lady of the house rather than her husband, who was often occupied with matters outside the household entirely: estate business, legal affairs, service to a local lord or to the crown itself, depending on the family's particular standing. Isabel's afternoon might begin with what we would now call household accounts, reviewing what the steward or the cook reports about stores remaining, deciding what needs replenishing from the next market day or from goods purchased directly from travelling merchants who called at larger houses specifically because they knew a household of this size represented real reliable business. She would need to understand with genuine precision how much grain remained against how much the household would need before the next harvest, how the salted meat stores were holding against the calendar of upcoming feast days and ordinary meals alike, whether the current supply of candles and rushlights would see the household through to when new ones could be made or bought. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates the picture of aristocratic women as purely ornamental figures, a picture some later centuries would work quite hard to construct, and that popular imagination sometimes still carries forward onto the Tudor period incorrectly. Isabel's actual daily function involves genuine consequential decision-making, the kind of logistical and financial management that in a modern context we might recognize as running a fairly substantial small business, one that happens to also be her home and that employs, depending on the household's particular size, anywhere from a handful to several dozen people, whose livelihoods depend directly on her competence. Needlework fills much of whatever time remains after these managerial duties, though it is worth distinguishing this from the exhausting essential spinning and sewing labour happening simultaneously in the cottage. Isabel's needlework is in large part decorative and skilled rather than purely functional. Fine embroidery worked onto linen or silk, patterns copied from pattern books that circulated among wealthy households, sometimes original designs of her own devising. This work still represents genuine labour, genuine skill developed over years of practice, but it exists in a different category from the cottage woman's spinning, driven by different pressures aimed at different outcomes, closer to what we might now call a valued accomplishment than a survival necessity, even though the household in real terms benefits from the beautifully worked linens and hangings that result. Isabel's children, if she has reached the age and circumstance to have them, experience a childhood that diverges sharply from what we saw in the cottage, though perhaps not quite as sharply as you might first assume. Very young children, regardless of the household's wealth, spend their earliest years largely in the company of women, nurses in Isabel's case rather than an overworked mother handling everything herself, but the fundamental experience of infancy and toddlerhood carries real similarities across the class divide. Swaddling, breastfeeding or wet nursing depending on the family's particular customs and resources, a world still centered on immediate physical care regardless of what lay beyond the nursery door. Where the experience diverges sharply is in what happens as these children grow older. A son in Isabel's household, by around 7 years old, might be sent away entirely, placed in another noble household to be raised and educated there, a practice that strikes modern sensibilities as almost shockingly cold, but that Tudor families understood as a genuine advantage, exposing a boy to different influences, different connections, a broader education than his own household alone could provide, while simultaneously receiving another family's son in return, a kind of mutual exchange that built alliance and obligation between households across an entire generation. A daughter might remain home longer, educated in household management, in the needlework and social accomplishments her future role would demand, perhaps taught to read, sometimes even taught some Latin or French if the family valued female education particularly highly, though this varied enormously from household to household, and depended considerably on individual parents' particular views. The cottage children we met earlier, by contrast, remain almost entirely within their own family and immediate community, their education consisting entirely of practical apprenticeship in the skills their own life will require, absorbed through direct observation and steadily increasing responsibility, rather than anything resembling formal instruction. And yet here again, the comparison resists easy conclusions. The cottage child, however materially poor, grows up embedded in a stable, continuous family relationship that Isabel's son, sent away at 7 to a stranger's household, does not experience in quite the same way. Neither childhood is simply better than the other. They are different educations for different lives, each preparing a child for the particular world that child will actually inhabit as an adult. When illness reaches the manor, the resources available to meet it differ from the cottage in degree far more than in fundamental kind, and that distinction matters. Isabel's household can afford to consult an actual physician, a university-trained man who arrives with genuine credentials, Latin learning, and a framework built on that same humoral theory we mentioned before, the belief in 4 bodily fluids requiring careful balance. His treatments might include bloodletting performed with more precision and ceremony than the cottage's rougher versions of the same practice, complex compounded remedies built from ingredients far more expensive and exotic than anything the cottage garden could supply, and a bedside manner shaped by considerable social awareness of exactly whose favour and future patronage he is hoping to secure through this particular visit. And here is the detail that genuinely surprises people when they first encounter it, the detail I promised myself I would make sure to include tonight. This expensive, credentialed, university-trained medicine was not, in any consistent, measurable sense, actually more effective than the cottage's folk remedies. In some documented cases, it was measurably worse because aggressive bloodletting performed on an already weakened patient could hasten death rather than prevent it. Because some of the compounded remedies physicians prescribed contained genuinely toxic substances, mercury among them, used with a confidence entirely unsupported by any real understanding of what mercury actually does to the human body over repeated exposure. Wealth bought access to more medicine. It did not reliably buy access to better medicine, not in any way we would now recognize as clinically meaningful, and there is something almost startling in sitting with that fact, a reminder that money, even considerable money, could not purchase what simply did not yet exist to be purchased. Genuine scientific understanding of disease and the body. Evening arrives differently in each household too, though both in their own ways begin winding down as the light fails, because artificial lighting throughout this century remains expensive and limited enough that most human activity still organizes itself substantially around the sun's actual schedule, rather than working comfortably against it the way we do now. In the cottage, as the afternoon's light begins to fade, our woman turns toward the evening's final tasks. Animals to be settled for the night if the household keeps any, the fire to be built back up for the evening meal, and then carefully banked down afterward to preserve a coal through the coming darkness. The day's accumulated small mending and preparation for tomorrow completed by whatever light remains, supplemented perhaps by a simple tallow candle or a rushlight, a length of dried rush dipped in animal fat that burns dim, smoky, and none too pleasant smelling, but burns cheaply enough that even this modest household can afford a few for the darkest evenings of winter. Supper here is lighter than the midday dinner, often simply bread with whatever remains from earlier in the day, perhaps a little cheese, washed down again with small beer. The family gathers close to the fire, because evening cold in a house with no chimney and only a single central hearth means warmth concentrates heavily near the flames and drops considerably as you move toward the room's edges. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the genuinely warm moments in a demanding day. Bodies gathered close together in the firelight, perhaps some quiet conversation, perhaps a story told from memory because books, even if this household happened to include someone who could read, which was far from guaranteed among the rural poor, remain rare and valuable objects that a cottage household would be very unlikely to own even a single one of. Sleep comes early by our modern standards, driven by both the physical exhaustion of a day this demanding and the simple practical fact that continuing to burn candles or rush lights deep into the night costs money and resources this household cannot easily spare. The whole family often sleeps in the same room, sometimes the same bed if the household is small enough, or the winter cold enough to make shared warmth genuinely valuable, rather than merely traditional, under blankets that have been mended and remended across years, sometimes generations, of continuous use. The fire is banked one final time, ash carefully mounded over the last coals, and the house settles into a darkness broken only by whatever moonlight might filter through the small shuttered window, waiting for that same cold hand to reach into the ashes again in a few short hours and begin the entire cycle over. The manor's evening moves at a different pace entirely, though it too eventually surrenders to the practical limits that darkness imposes on everyone in this century, wealthy and poor alike, because even the grandest household cannot simply manufacture unlimited daylight. Supper here, the day's final meal, is lighter than the elaborate midday dinner but still considerably more substantial than the cottage's simple bread and cheese, cold meats left from the day's earlier cooking, perhaps a light pottage or a dish of eggs, bread, and whatever fruit the season and the household's stores provide. After supper, the hall often becomes a space for whatever entertainment the household's resources and the particular evening's occasion call for. Music features prominently in households that can afford it, whether through family members who have learnt an instrument themselves, the virginals or the lute being particularly fashionable choices for a woman of Isabel's standing to have studied, or through musicians employed or engaged specifically for the household's entertainment. Cards and dice games circulate too, along with the simple pleasure of conversation extended by candlelight, In a way, the cottage, watching every rushlight and tallow candle for its cost, cannot easily afford to indulge in for very long. And here the candlelight itself deserves a moment's attention, because it represents another quiet but genuine marker of the gap between these two households. Where the cottage relies on cheap, smoky, dim rushlights or the roughest tallow candles, a manor household of real means can afford beeswax candles, burning cleaner, brighter, and very considerably longer than tallow, without the acrid smell and thick smoke that tallow inevitably produces as it burns. Beeswax candles were, in fact, expensive enough that they functioned as a genuine luxury good throughout this entire period. Reserved in many households for the finest rooms and the most important occasions, while tallow, cheaper but far less pleasant, lit the more everyday corners of even a wealthy household's daily life. Isabel's private chamber, in the evening, likely glows with beeswax. The kitchen and the servants' quarters, even here in this grand house, likely make do with tallow's dimmer, smokier light, the same substance burning in the cottage a quarter-mile away, a small but genuine point of connection running underneath everything that otherwise divides these two very different homes. Isabel's retiring for the night, when it finally comes, involves its own small ceremony, her body servant returning to help unpin and unlace the day's careful dressing. The outer layers set aside and hung or folded with genuine care because these garments represent real, considerable investment and cannot simply be discarded or replaced casually. Her hair is unpinned, brushed out again in long strokes, perhaps rebraided loosely for sleep. The bed itself, when she finally settles into it, represents another enormous gap between these two households, a proper bedstead raised well off the floor, a genuine feather mattress rather than the cottage's straw pallet, curtains that can be drawn around the bed's frame to trap warmth and block drafts in a room that, whatever its other comforts, still sits within a house built long before anyone had conceived of insulation in any form we would recognize now. And yet, in the deepest part of the night, something genuinely equalizing happens across both these households. Something worth noticing precisely because it cuts against every other difference we have traced tonight. Both Isabel and the cottage woman sleep eventually in genuine darkness, broken only by whatever fire or candle each household has chosen to preserve through the night, under a sky that neither electric light nor any other modern intrusion has yet begun to dim. Both will wake, in their own way, to a world still organized entirely around daylight's actual arrival and departure, a rhythm that 100 generations before them lived inside just as completely, and that only a handful of generations after them would begin, slowly and then very quickly, to leave behind entirely. Let us step back now from these two particular households and let the seasons move around them, because everything we have described so far represents, in a sense, an ordinary day pulled out of the calendar's flow, and a Tudor year was never actually made of identical days repeating endlessly. Winter reshaped both households in ways that summer's relative ease could never fully prepare a person for, and it is worth sitting with what that reshaping actually meant. For the cottage family, winter meant a daily calculation more anxious than any other season demanded. Fuel stores measured carefully against the weeks remaining until spring. Food stores watched with a kind of vigilance that never quite left a person's mind even while their hands were busy with something else entirely. The garden that fed the household through summer and autumn stood bare and frozen. Whatever grain, dried peas, salted meat, and preserved food the family had managed to store away needed to stretch across months with no fresh replenishment possible, and a bad harvest the previous autumn could mean, by February or March, genuine hunger, not the mild inconvenience the word sometimes suggests to modern ears, but real, gnawing, dangerous hunger that thinned bodies and weakened resistance to the illnesses that winter's cold and crowding made more likely to spread through a household in the first place. Cold itself becomes almost an active presence in the cottage during these months. The single hearth fire, however carefully tended, struggles to warm a room built from timber and wattle and darb, that offers only modest insulation against genuine winter temperatures. Frost sometimes forms on the inside of shuttered windows. Water left standing overnight in a bucket, might carry a skin of ice by morning. The family's clothing, already limited, gets layered as thickly as the household's modest wardrobe allows. And still, by any modern standard, this is a household spending its winter genuinely cold for a very large portion of every single day, warm only in the narrow zone directly around the hearth. And even there, warm only relative to the bitter cold just a few feet further away. The manor experiences winter's edge too, though considerably softened by resources the cottage simply does not possess. Multiple hearths mean multiple rooms can be kept at least partially warm, though even here the largest and grandest rooms, the great hall especially with its high open ceiling, remain genuinely difficult to heat evenly, and household accounts from the period sometimes note the considerable quantities of fuel, wood in some regions, increasingly coal in others as the century progressed, and wood grew scarcer and more expensive in certain areas, that winter demanded from an estate's resources. Isabel's chamber, smaller and more easily heated than the great hall, likely stayed considerably more comfortable through the coldest months. Another quiet marker of how wealth translated, in this period, less into eliminating hardship entirely and more into concentrating comfort into smaller, more manageable, more carefully protected spaces. Winter also reshaped the working calendar for both households in ways connected directly to the agricultural rhythm underlying almost the entire English economy at this time. For the cottage family, whose labour connected directly to the land whether through their own small holding or through work performed for a larger landowner, winter meant a shift away from the fieldwork that dominated spring through autumn toward indoor tasks, that endless spinning and textile production we described earlier, tool repair, the slaughter and processing of animals that could not be fed through a lean winter, work that continued the household's survival through different means once the fields themselves offered nothing more to give. Feast days and the church calendar punctuated this seasonal rhythm for every household in England, regardless of wealth, because the entire year in this century organized itself substantially around a religious calendar that structured not just Sunday worship, but the whole rhythm of labor, celebration, and rest across every single week. Christmas, or Christmastide as it was more commonly understood, extended across 12 full days, a period of genuine celebration and reduced labor that both the cottage and the manor observed, though naturally with very different resources devoted to the observance. The cottage might manage a slightly better than usual meal, perhaps meat if a pig's slaughter had been timed to provide for it, some small exchange of simple gifts, perhaps a visit from neighbours or family living nearby. The manor mounted something considerably grander, feasting on a scale we described earlier, entertainment, gift-giving that reflected and reinforced the household's social position among its peers and its obligations toward those beneath it in the local hierarchy. Easter brought its own rhythm, preceded by the genuine hardship of Lent, a period of fasting and dietary restriction observed, at least in principle, across the entire social spectrum, meat forbidden on many days, fish taking its place instead, a restriction that shaped English fishing and food trade in ways that rippled outward through the whole economy. For the cottage, already living close to the margin of what its food stores could provide, Lent's restrictions sometimes barely registered as additional hardship, because meat was already a rare enough luxury that its temporary formal prohibition changed little about the actual daily table. For the manor, accustomed to meat in genuine abundance, Lent required real adjustment, elaborate fish dishes taking meat's place at the high table, the kitchen staff drawing on preserved and fresh fish, eels, and other permitted foods to construct meals, still impressive enough to maintain the household's standard of hospitality and display even within the season's formal restrictions. Market Day deserves its own attention here, because it is one of the few moments in this century's calendar where the cottage and the manor genuinely occupy the same physical space, walking the same streets, handling many of the same goods, even if the quantities and qualities they leave with differ enormously. A market town within reasonable walking or cart distance of both our households would hold its market on a set day each week, drawing sellers and buyers from the surrounding countryside, into a temporary, crowded, genuinely loud convergence of the entire local economy. Our cottage woman on market day might walk several miles carrying whatever small surplus her household has managed to produce, perhaps eggs beyond what the family itself needs, perhaps a length of thread she has spun beyond her own household's requirements, perhaps a few vegetables from a garden that produced slightly more than expected this particular week. She trades these small surpluses for whatever her household genuinely lacks. Salt, which almost no household could produce for itself, and which represented a genuine necessity for preserving meat through the winter. Perhaps a small quantity of a spice too modest to have any place in the manner's kitchen, but still, in tiny amounts within her own household's occasional reach. Iron goods from a smith, a replacement needle, a length of ribbon that represents pure, simple pleasure rather than any practical necessity at all. A small extravagance she allows herself perhaps once or twice a year. The manor's presence in this same market looks completely different in scale and character. A steward or trusted senior servant, sent specifically for this purpose, arrives with considerably more coin and considerably more specific requirements, negotiating directly with the most substantial merchants and producers, rather than trading small surplus goods hand to hand the way the cottage woman does. Larger quantities change hands here, grain purchased in bulk if the household's own stores run short, fine cloth ordered from a merchant who specializes in exactly that trade, spices purchased in whatever quantity a traveling spice merchant happens to have brought to this particular market on this particular week. And this steward, notably, often has genuine ongoing relationships with specific merchants built across years of repeated business, relationships that themselves represent a kind of economic advantage entirely unavailable to the cottage family, who lack both the volume of business and the accumulated trust that makes a merchant willing to extend credit or offer preferential terms. Clothing, which we touched on earlier through the cottage's laborious spinning and weaving process, deserves a fuller look now, because it functioned in this century as one of the clearest, most immediately visible markers of social position that existed anywhere in English life. Sumptuary laws, actual legislation passed by Parliament across various points in this century, attempted to regulate quite specifically who was permitted to wear which fabrics, which colours, which furs, based directly on social rank and income, an attempt to keep the visible signals of status legible and stable, in a period when new wealth, particularly merchant wealth, was beginning to complicate the older, simpler picture of aristocratic birth as the sole marker of standing. Purple and certain shades of red silk, cloth of gold and cloth of silver, ermine and other particularly fine furs, these were legally restricted to the highest ranks of nobility and royalty, regardless of whether a wealthy merchant might have genuinely been able to afford them. The cottage family's wool, undyed or dyed with the simplest and cheapest locally available dyes, madder for red tones, woad for blue, sat at the very opposite end of this legally enforced spectrum, not merely because the family could not afford finer fabric, but because in a very real legal sense, they were not permitted to wear it even if they somehow had. I find something genuinely strange and worth pausing on in that fact. The idea that clothing was not simply a matter of taste or means, but of actual law, that what covered your body announced your legal and social category to everyone who looked at you, with real legal consequences attached to getting that announcement wrong. Isabel's household would have understood these laws intimately, dressing not just for comfort or personal preference, but for the precise, calibrated display of exactly the status the family held and, quite often, exactly the status the family hoped to be seen as approaching, pushing right up against the boundary of what their particular rank permitted without technically crossing it. Let us return for a while to the houses themselves, because we have spent considerable time inside both of them without ever really examining how they were built, and the construction methods of this century tell their own quiet story about resources, skill, and the very different relationships these two households held with the materials that sheltered them. The cottage's walls, as we mentioned early on, are built using a technique called wattle and daub, a method genuinely ancient by the 1500s, practiced in England in one form or another for well over 1,000 years before this particular century began. A timber frame provides the structural skeleton, oak most commonly where it could be had, though other wood served where oak was scarce or expensive, and between these structural timbers, a woven lattice of thinner branches or split wood, the wattle, creates a kind of baskwork infill. Onto this woven lattice, daub gets pressed and smoothed by hand, a mixture typically combining clay or mud with straw and sometimes animal dung, the dung serving a genuinely practical binding function rather than being included carelessly, its fibrous content helping hold the whole mixture together as it dries and hardens. This construction method required real skill, though it was skill widely distributed across rural communities rather than concentrated among specialized master craftsmen, the way stone or brickwork tended to be. Almost any capable adult in a farming community would have at least a working knowledge of wattle and daub construction and repair, because houses built this way required regular maintenance, patches where daub had crumbled or washed away in heavy rain, sections that needed genuine rebuilding after years of weather and use had worn through the original work. Our cottage woman, if asked, could likely mix and apply daub herself, another quiet example of the practical competence this world demanded from ordinary people as simply the unremarkable baseline of adult capability. The roof above this cottage, thatched with straw or reed depending on what grew most abundantly nearby, represented its own considerable investment of skill and labour, though the actual thatching itself was typically performed by a specialist thatcher rather than the household itself, a trade skilled and specific enough that it commanded genuine respect and reliable, if modest, income within a rural community. A well-maintained thatched roof could last several decades, shedding rain effectively, providing genuine insulation against both summer heat and winter cold, though it came with real risks too, most seriously fire, because thatch burns with a speed and intensity that made house fires in this century a genuinely terrifying and common danger, capable of destroying not just a single home, but spreading rapidly through closely built villages, where one burning roof could easily ignite its neighbours before anyone had time to organise an effective response. Construction at the manor tells a different story from the ground up. Its timber frame, while built using fundamentally related techniques, employs considerably larger, more carefully selected timbers, often oak of a size and quality that only a household with real access to woodland resources, either owned outright or purchased at real expense, could obtain. Where the cottage's frame might be relatively modest in scale, the manor's frame reaches higher, spans wider, supports a genuinely impressive open hall roof that required both superior materials and superior carpentry skill, a master carpenter's expertise commanding wages and respect considerably beyond what an ordinary rural builder could expect to earn. Increasingly across this century, particularly among the wealthiest and most fashion-conscious households, brick began supplementing or entirely replacing timber frame construction for at least portions of a great house, a shift driven partly by genuine practical advantages, brick's superior fire resistance chief among them, and partly by brick's status as a genuinely fashionable, visibly expensive building material that announced a household's wealth and modernity to anyone who saw it. Hampton Court, built and expanded during exactly this period, stands as perhaps the most famous example of this brick-building fashion, though obviously on a scale that dwarfed even the wealthiest ordinary gentry household's own more modest brick ambitions. Glass, too, marks a genuine and steadily shifting boundary between these households across the century. Early in the period, glazed windows remained rare and expensive enough that even fairly comfortable households often made do with shutters alone or with thin sheets of horn or oiled linen stretched across a window opening, materials that let in some light while blocking wind and rain, though nothing like the clarity glass provided. By the middle and later decades of the century, glass had become steadily more available and more affordable, though still representing real expense. And a household like Isabel's, glazing at least its principal rooms, communicated genuine contemporary fashion and means through this choice, while the cottage, almost unmistakably, continued relying on simple wooden shutters right through the century's end and well beyond it, glass remaining, for the rural poor, a luxury that would not become genuinely ordinary for centuries yet to come. Let us talk about birth for a moment, because it touches both these households in ways that reveal, perhaps more starkly than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, just how differently wealth could shape even the most fundamentally universal human experiences. When our cottage woman gives birth, and by the time she reaches 30 she has very likely already done this several times, the event unfolds almost entirely within a female community rather than under any kind of formal medical supervision. A local midwife, herself typically an older woman of the community who has learned her craft through years of practical experience and informal apprenticeship to an earlier generation of midwives, attends the birth, assisted often by neighboring women, friends, and relatives who gather specifically for this purpose, a genuine community response to an event every woman present understood intimately from her own experience. This birth happens in the cottage's single main room, the same room where every other domestic activity we have described tonight also takes place, near the hearth for warmth, on whatever bedding the household can provide, without anything resembling the sterile, controlled environment we would now consider standard. Childbirth in this period, for women of every social rank, carried genuine and substantial risk that fell without any real regard for wealth or status, because the underlying dangers, infection chief among them, along with hemorrhage and complications that surgical intervention could not yet safely address, existed largely beyond what any amount of money in this century could actually purchase protection against. Isabel's own experience of childbirth when her time comes differs in comfort and ceremony far more than in actual medical safety. She would retreat in the weeks before her expected delivery into a practice called lying in, withdrawing from the household's daily business into her own chamber, attended by a chosen circle of female relatives and friends, the room's windows sometimes deliberately covered or curtained according to prevailing beliefs about protecting both mother and child from bad air and evil influences during this vulnerable period. A midwife attends her too, though possibly one with a somewhat broader reputation and higher fee than the cottage relies on. And the room itself naturally offers considerably more physical comfort, a proper bed, clean linen in genuine abundance, warmth maintained by servants tending the chamber's fire around the clock if the season demands it. And yet, despite every advantage money could provide, Isabel faced genuinely comparable mortality risk to the cottage woman a quarter-mile away, because the actual medical understanding required to make childbirth meaningfully safer simply did not exist yet for anyone, regardless of how much they could afford to pay for it. Queens themselves, women with access to the very finest attendance 16th century England could offer, died in childbirth or from its aftermath during this exact period, a fact that underscores just how genuinely universal this particular danger remained across every level of the social hierarchy we have spent tonight exploring. Wealth bought comfort during childbirth. It bought attendance, cleanliness relative to what was possible, warmth, and the particular psychological comfort of familiar faces and familiar surroundings. It did not buy safety in any way we would now recognize as medically meaningful, and I think that fact deserves real weight because it complicates so cleanly any simple story we might otherwise tell ourselves about wealth simply solving every problem it touches. Disease, more broadly, held this same strange equalizing power throughout the century, though plainly not an equal power in every single instance. The sweating sickness, a genuinely mysterious illness that appeared periodically throughout this period and killed with frightening speed, sometimes taking a person from apparent good health to death within a single day, showed a documented tendency to strike the wealthy and the socially prominent with particular severity, for reasons that remain genuinely unclear even to modern historians and epidemiologists who have studied the surviving records closely. Plague, by contrast, tended to fall more heavily on crowded, poorer urban populations where close living conditions and limited resources for isolation or flight made containment far more difficult, though wealthy households were never entirely safe from it either, and the wealthy in this period often responded to plague's arrival in a town or region with genuine flight to rural estates, a strategy the cottage family, tied to their land and their labour, simply did not have the freedom to pursue for themselves. Religion threaded through every single day we have described tonight in ways almost too pervasive to fully separate out as a distinct topic, though it is worth pausing here deliberately because this particular century saw England's religious landscape shift more dramatically than perhaps any other in the country's entire history. And that shift touched both our households, even if it touched them in different ways and to different degrees. The parish church stood quite literally at the centre of every English community, the cottage family and the manor household alike attending services there, though naturally occupying very different positions within the building itself. The manor family often holding a designated pew or even a small private chapel space, elevated and visible, while the cottage family stood or sat in the body of the church among their neighbours, the physical arrangement of the congregation itself quietly reinforcing the same social hierarchy that shaped every other aspect of these two households' lives. Henry VIII's break with Rome, formalised across the 1530s, and the subsequent dissolution of England's monasteries that followed close behind it, reshaped this religious landscape in ways that rippled outward through both wealth and poverty in genuinely significant ways. Monasteries had functioned for centuries before their dissolution as one of the few reliable sources of organised charity available to England's poorest households, distributing food, sometimes medical care of a rudimentary kind, and basic material support to those genuinely in need within their local area. When these institutions were dissolved, their lands and wealth seized by the crown and very often subsequently sold or granted to exactly the kind of gentry and noble families our manor household represents, the charitable function largely disappeared without any immediately adequate replacement, a gap that later Tudor legislation, particularly the Poor Laws developed toward the century's end, would attempt to address through a more formal parish-based system of poor relief, though never quite replacing what had been lost. For the manor household, by contrast, this same dissolution often represented genuine, substantial opportunity. Families positioned favourably at court, or simply wealthy enough to purchase former monastic lands as they came onto the market, could expand their landholdings considerably during exactly this period, converting former monastery buildings into grand private houses in some of the most striking architectural transformations of the entire century, or simply absorbing the agricultural land itself into their existing estates. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means that the very gap in charitable support this upheaval created for households like our cottage family was in some direct and traceable cases the exact same transaction that enriched households like Isabel's, the same land changing hands in a transfer that closed one door while opening another, though assuredly not evenly, and very much not for the same people on both sides of that exchange. The cottage family's religious practice, meanwhile, continued largely unchanged in its basic daily rhythm, despite these enormous institutional upheavals happening somewhere above their immediate experience. Prayer remained woven through the ordinary day, before meals, before sleep, at moments of particular difficulty or hope, a practice requiring no institutional support at all, carried entirely within individual memory and habit. Sunday worship continued, whatever theological framework the parish church now operated under following the various religious changes of successive Tudor monarchs, because attendance remained for most of this century not simply customary but legally required, with genuine penalties attached to persistent absence, a requirement that fell on cottage and manor alike, though enforcement and consequence, as with so much else in this world, could vary considerably depending on a household's local standing and connections. Let us imagine now a single day that pulls both these households together, because such days did exist, scattered through the calendar, and they reveal something neither household's ordinary routine quite shows on its own. A parish feast day, perhaps the celebration of the church's patron saint, or a harvest festival marking the successful gathering of the year's grain, drew the entire local community together in a way few other occasions managed. Cottage families and manor households sharing, for these few hours, a genuinely common physical space and a genuinely common experience, even while the underlying inequalities between them never fully disappeared even here. Picture the churchyard or the village green on such a day, trestle tables set up outdoors if the weather permits, food contributed according to each household's means, the manor very likely providing the largest single contribution, perhaps an entire roasted animal, ale brewed in quantity specifically for the occasion, while cottage families bring smaller offerings, bread, perhaps a dish made from whatever the household's garden or animals could spare beyond its own immediate needs. Music plays, simple instruments, pipes and drums and fiddles, and there is dancing, genuine unrestrained community dancing that briefly, temporarily, blurs some of the careful social distinctions both households maintain so precisely during their ordinary days. Our cottage woman, on a day like this, might find herself dancing near, even briefly partnered with, someone from a social rank she would never ordinarily interact with so directly, and Isabel watching from wherever the manor family has positioned itself, whether joining the dancing herself or observing with the particular blend of participation and distance her rank requires, experiences her own community in a register entirely different from the managed, hierarchical interactions of an ordinary week. These occasions mattered enormously to the whole fabric of rural English life, precisely because they offered this temporary loosening, a release valve for a social structure that otherwise maintained its distinctions with real rigidity almost every other day of the year. And by the day's end, as the tables are cleared and the last of the ale is finished, and families begin the walk or the short journey back to their own separate homes, the ordinary distinctions reassert themselves almost immediately. The cottage woman returns to a house with a cold hearth waiting to be built again tomorrow at 4 in the morning. Isabel returns to a house where a servant has already been tending the fires throughout the evening, ensuring warmth waits ready for the family's return. The feast day was real. The community it briefly created was real, and the underlying structure of who serves and who is served, who rises in darkness and who wakes to warmth already prepared, resumes its ordinary shape the very next morning, exactly as it had every morning before this brief, genuine, temporary exception. Let us think for a moment about the servants within the manor more broadly, because we have met our fire-tending girl and briefly toured the kitchen hierarchy, but a household of real size employed a genuinely wide range of roles, each with its own particular rhythm and demands. A steward oversaw the entire household's practical operation, managing accounts, supervising staff, representing the family in various business dealings, a position of genuine trust and, often, genuine social mobility, because a capable steward might himself come from relatively modest origins and rise, through skill and loyalty, into a position commanding real respect and reasonable wealth. A chaplain, in households grand enough to employ one, managed the family's religious observance and often served as tutor to the children, another role that drew educated men from backgrounds that might otherwise have offered them considerably less opportunity. Below these senior positions, the household employed grooms to manage horses and stables, essential given how thoroughly this entire society depended on horses for transportation and, for the wealthy, for the hunting that formed such a central part of gentry and noble social life. Gardeners tended whatever grounds the house maintained, kitchen gardens for practical food production alongside, in the grandest households, more purely ornamental gardens designed for beauty and status display alone. Laundresses, as we discussed, handled the household's considerable textile needs, and throughout every level of this hierarchy, personal loyalty and personal relationship mattered enormously. A household's smooth functioning depending not just on clearly defined roles, but on the accumulated trust and familiarity built between family members and the servants who had, in many cases, served that same family for years or even decades, sometimes across multiple generations of both the serving and the served families alike. Let us step outside the countryside itself for a while, because not every Tudor household lived on farmland or within a manor's orbit, and the towns of this century held their own particular version of hidden domestic labour, one worth understanding before we return to our two households for the night's final hours. In a market town, a household might belong to a craftsman, a baker, a weaver, a smith, someone who has trained for years through the guild system that governed most skilled urban trades with real thoroughness and real formality. A boy entering an apprenticeship, often around the age of 14, bound himself legally to a master craftsman for a term that commonly ran 7 years, living within the master's household throughout that entire period, receiving training in the trade's particular skills alongside room, board, and only a very modest wage, if any wage at all beyond his basic keep. This arrangement, formalized through a legal document called an indenture, created obligations running in both directions, the master required to teach genuinely and treat the apprentice with reasonable care, the apprentice required to work diligently and avoid behavior that might embarrass or financially harm the household he had joined. Only after completing this full term, and often after producing what the guild called a masterpiece, a piece of work demonstrating genuine mastery of the trade's full range of skills, could a former apprentice apply to become a master himself, entitled to open his own workshop and train apprentices of his own in turn. The household of such a craftsman, whether baker or weaver or smith, blended domestic and working life in ways neither the cottage nor the manor quite replicates, the workshop often occupying the ground floor of the same building the family lived in above, apprentices and any additional hired journeymen, craftsmen who had completed their training but not yet achieved master status themselves, sleeping and eating within the household right alongside the master's own family. The master's wife, in households like these, often played a genuinely significant role in the business itself, managing accounts, handling customers, sometimes possessing real practical knowledge of the trade, even though guild membership itself remained restricted to men in the overwhelming majority of trades throughout this period, with certain specific and interesting exceptions in trades like brewing and some branches of textile work where women held more formal, recognized standing. This urban household's rhythm followed the demands of its particular trade rather than the agricultural calendar shaping both our cottage and manor households. A baker's household woke in the deepest part of the night, considerably earlier even than our cottage woman's 4 in the morning start, because bread needed to be baked and ready for sale by the early hours when customers began arriving, meaning the ovens themselves needed lighting and building to proper heat well before that, sometimes as early as 1 or 2 in the morning, and schedule that shaped the entire household's sleep and waking in ways that set it apart from almost every other kind of Tudor household we have discussed tonight. Now, though, let us return to our cottage and our manor, because the night is drawing in around both of them, and I want to sit with you inside that particular quiet a while longer before we let this story close entirely. There is a specific texture to a Tudor evening that is worth dwelling in properly, not rushed past, because it is exactly the kind of stillness this whole story has been building toward. In the cottage, the last hour before sleep carries its own small, careful rituals. Our woman moves through the room checking, almost without conscious thought at this point, the things that need checking before darkness fully takes hold. The animals, if the household keeps any, chickens perhaps, or a single precious pig being fattened toward autumn slaughter, need to be secured for the night, safe from whatever predators the surrounding countryside might send toward an unguarded pen in the dark. The door, a simple wooden construction, gets barred, a length of wood dropped into brackets on either side, a modest but genuine defense against both animal and human intrusion in a world where locks, in the sense we would now recognize them, remain rare and expensive enough that most rural households rely instead on this simpler, cruder, but perfectly functional barring system. The fire receives its final tending, ash mounded carefully over the last glowing coals in a technique that took genuine practice to perfect. Enough ash to smother open flame and slow the coals burning through the long hours ahead, but not so much ash that the coal suffocates entirely and dies before morning. This is a skill this woman has practiced literally thousands of times by now, her hands moving through the motion with an economy and confidence that required years to build, though she herself would likely never think to describe it as a skill at all, simply as the ordinary, unremarkable last task of an ordinary day. Her children, tangled together under their single mended blanket, have usually already drifted towards sleep by the time this final tending happens, worn out by a day that asked genuine physical labor of even the youngest hands capable of contributing it, our woman settles beside them, perhaps with a final quiet word to her husband if he is home this particular night, rather than away at whatever seasonal labor might have called him elsewhere for a few days. And the room, lit now only by the faint orange glow leaking from beneath the ash-covered coals, settles into the particular darkness of a house with no candle left burning, a darkness genuinely thick and complete in a way almost nobody living now, surrounded by whatever ambient electric light modern life provides even at its darkest hour, has ever fully experienced. Sound fills this darkness too, worth noticing, because a Tudor night was never actually silent, whatever the word suggests. Somewhere outside an owl calls, a sound this household would recognize instantly and think nothing of, so familiar it barely registers as a sound at all, rather than simply the ordinary texture of nighttime. Wind moves against the thatch overhead, a low steady sound punctuated occasionally by something shifting or settling within the roof structure itself. If the household keeps animals, their own small sounds drift in from wherever they are secured, a shifting of weight, an occasional soft vocalization, and underneath all of it, the house's own particular sounds, timber contracting slightly as the temperature drops further through the night, the faint tick and settle of a structure that, however humble, still holds its own small symphony of barely audible movement even in its stillest hours. Sleep, when it comes to bodies genuinely exhausted in a way that modern life, for most of us, rarely produces anymore. This is not the restless, screen-lit, anxious tiredness so many of us carry into bed now. This is the deep, complete exhaustion of muscles that have carried water and scrubbed floors and spun thread and tended fire for 12 or 14 genuine hours without meaningful pause. Whatever worries this woman carries into sleep, and she in fact carries some, the health of a child who seemed a little warm at supper, whether the grain stores will genuinely stretch to the next harvest, whatever small tension might exist between herself and her husband or a neighbor, these worries meet a body too thoroughly spent to hold on to them with much force, and sleep for households like this tended to arrive quickly and hold deeply, at least until 4 in the morning called her back toward that cold hearth once again. In the manner, this same hour unfolds with its own considerably different texture, though sharing, underneath all its differences, that same essential human surrender to night's arrival. Isabel's chamber, warmed by its fire, lit now only by a single candle her servant leaves burning low as she withdraws for her own rest elsewhere in the house, holds a stillness of its own kind, quieter perhaps in one sense, because stone or well-built timber walls block sound more effectively than the cottage's thinner construction, but filled with its own particular set of small night noises nonetheless. Somewhere below, a dog shifts and settles in the hall where it sleeps near the banked fire. Somewhere in the servants' quarters, the low murmur of 2 or 3 young women talking quietly before their own sleep finally takes hold. Voices pitched low enough not to disturb a household that expects genuine quiet once the family itself has retired. Isabel's own sleep carries different weight than the cottage woman's. Her body has not spent this day in the same kind of exhausting physical labor, though her mind has indeed worked, managing accounts, navigating whatever social obligations the day demanded, holding the household's considerable practical complexity in a kind of constant low-level attention that never fully switches off even during apparently restful hours. Her worries, when she carries them into sleep, might run toward different specific concerns than the cottage woman's, a daughter's eventual marriage prospects and the delicate diplomatic work required to secure a genuinely advantageous match, her husband's standing at court and whether recent political currents favor or threaten the family's position, the household's finances, and whether this year's harvest from the estate's own lands will meet the considerable expenses a household of this size and status inevitably generates. Different worries, carried by a body considerably less physically depleted than the one sleeping in the cottage a quarter-mile away, but worries nonetheless because wealth, we have seen again and again tonight, changes the shape of a burden far more often than it removes that burden entirely. Let us drift for a while into the particular textures of food again, because I think there is something genuinely soothing in dwelling on it a little longer. The specific dishes, the specific flavors, the actual physical experience of eating in this century, rather than simply the social structures surrounding who got to eat what. In the cottage kitchen, beyond the basic pottage we described earlier, certain dishes recur across the seasons with a familiarity that would have felt to this household exactly the way certain comfort foods feel to us now. Reliable, expected, quietly satisfying in their very predictability. Frumenty, a dish of wheat boiled slowly in milk, sometimes sweetened if honey happened to be available, sometimes enriched with egg if the household's hens were laying well, appears at various points through the year. A dish that takes real time to prepare properly, the wheat needing to soften gradually over gentle, sustained heat, but that rewards this patience with something genuinely comforting, warm and filling in a way that plain grain alone rarely manages. Pottage itself, we should say, was never really a single fixed recipe but an entire category of dish, endlessly variable depending on what the season and the household stores happened to provide. Sometimes thin and broth-like, sometimes thick enough that a spoon could nearly stand upright in it, the exact character shifting with the ingredients available on any particular week. Cheese-making occupied a genuine place in many cottage households too, particularly those keeping even a single cow or a small flock of sheep. Milk collected and, through processes passed down and refined across generations of women's practical knowledge, transformed into cheese that could be stored considerably longer than fresh milk itself, extending the household's access to this valuable protein source well beyond what fresh milk's short shelf life alone would allow. This cheese, simple and unaged by the standards of what we might associate with the word today, still represented genuine valued nutrition, eaten alongside bread as a reliable, if modest, everyday food. Ale brewing, too, happened within many individual households, rather than being purchased entirely from professional brewers, particularly in rural areas where a dedicated brewer might not be conveniently close. Our cottage woman likely brewed at least some of her household's ale herself, a process involving malted grain, water and thyme, the resulting beverage weak enough in alcohol content that it served as genuine everyday hydration for the entire family, children included, rather than functioning primarily as an intoxicant the way we might now assume. This detail always strikes people as strange when they first encounter it, the idea of children drinking beer as a matter of ordinary daily routine. But the alcohol content of this small beer, as it was called, sat low enough, and the actual water quality concerns of the period genuine enough, that it represented in practice simply the safest widely available everyday drink, rather than anything approaching what we would now consider inappropriate for a child. In the manners kitchen, meanwhile, the range of dishes expands into genuine culinary artistry, particularly for feast occasions where the kitchen staff's skill had real opportunity to display itself fully. Elaborate pies, their pastry crusts, sometimes built less to be eaten than to serve as an edible container and impressive visual centerpiece, might contain multiple layers of different meats, fruits, and spices combined in ways that modern palates, accustomed to savory and sweet occupying largely separate categories, would likely find genuinely surprising. Meat pies sweetened with dried fruit and warm spices, a blending of flavor categories that this century's cooking embraced with real confidence, rather than treating as any kind of unusual combination. Sauces, too, occupied considerable attention in the wealthy kitchen, built from wine, vinegar, and those expensive imported spices, designed specifically to complement and enhance whatever meat or fish they accompanied, a level of culinary sophistication that required genuine training and genuine skill to execute well, and that the master cook we mentioned earlier would have spent years perfecting before earning the considerable trust and reasonable wage his position commanded. Sugar, when it appeared, arrived as an expensive imported luxury rather than the cheap, abundant substance it would later become, used sparingly and specifically in dishes meant to display the household's wealth as much as to please the palate. Elaborate sugar sculptures called subtleties, sometimes constructed for the grandest occasions. Edible artwork built purely for visual impact and conversation before ultimately being eaten or, in some grand households, simply admired and eventually discarded once their decorative purpose had been served. Gardens deserve their own moment of attention too, because they served genuinely different functions in each household, even while sharing the same basic underlying purpose of coaxing useful plants from English soil. The cottage garden, small and intensively worked, existed almost entirely for practical necessity: vegetables for the pot, herbs for both flavour and medicine, perhaps a few fruit trees if space and soil allowed. Every square foot valued for what it could contribute to the household's survival through the coming year. Nothing grew here purely for beauty. Beauty, when it appeared at all, arrived as an incidental byproduct of usefulness: the pale flowers of a bean plant, the particular green of new cabbage leaves after rain, noticed perhaps, appreciated perhaps, but never the actual point of the labour involved in growing it. The manors grounds, by contrast, increasingly through this century, began incorporating gardens designed at least partly for pleasure and display alongside their practical kitchen garden function, a shift that reflected broader European fashions gradually making their way into English great house design. Knot gardens, intricate geometric patterns of clipped low hedges, typically boxwood or a similar plant tolerant of frequent trimming, arranged the ground into designs meant to be admired, particularly from an elevated vantage point like an upper window where the pattern's full geometric complexity could be properly appreciated. These gardens required considerable ongoing labour to maintain their precise shapes, another category of work performed by dedicated garden staff specifically so that Isabel and her family could enjoy the finished result without personally managing the endless clipping and weeding such precision demanded. Hunting occupied a genuinely significant place in the leisure life of households like Isabel's, though leisure perhaps understates how seriously this activity was actually treated, functioning simultaneously as recreation, as practical food gathering, and as a genuine display of social status, because access to hunting grounds, particularly for larger game like deer, was itself legally restricted in ways that echoed the sumptuary laws we discussed earlier around clothing. Forest law and various related regulations reserved considerable hunting rights for the nobility and gentry, making the simple act of pursuing and taking a deer something the cottage family could not legally do even if opportunity and desire aligned, a restriction enforced with real severity in various periods of English history. Poaching treated not as minor theft, but as a genuine, serious offence against the social order itself. Isabel's husband, and often Isabel herself, since women of her rank did participate in hunting to a degree that might surprise people expecting this activity to have been an exclusively male domain, would ride out with hounds and hawks across the estate's grounds and surrounding countryside, an activity requiring genuine skill, genuine investment in trained animals and equipment, and genuine leisure time that the cottage family's endless daily labour simply never afforded them. Falconry particularly carried enormous prestige, the specific type of bird a person was permitted to fly determined, in some formulations of the period's social codes, quite precisely by rank, though how strictly this particular convention was actually followed in practice varied considerably. Let us think, too, about the physical layout of the grandest houses of this period, because architecture itself increasingly began reflecting a desire for privacy that earlier centuries' great halls, with their communal eating and communal living we described earlier, had never particularly prioritized. The long gallery, a genuinely distinctive feature that became increasingly fashionable through the middle and later decades of this century, provided an enclosed, sheltered space, often running the full length of a house's upper floor, where the family could walk for exercise regardless of weather, could display portraits and other art specifically for private family appreciation rather than public hall display, could hold private conversations away from the household's wider staff, and any visitors present in the more public rooms below. The privy chamber similarly represented a genuine shift toward private family space, a room reserved for the immediate family's use, increasingly separated from the wider household's daily traffic in ways that the earlier medieval Great Hall tradition, with its communal eating we described in Isabel's morning breakfast scene, had never quite provided. This architectural evolution across the century tells its own quiet story, a wealthy household gradually withdrawing from the older, more communally visible way of living, retreating into spaces the ordinary household staff, and quite genuinely the cottage family a quarter-mile away would never see the inside of, a privacy that itself became, alongside chimneys and glass windows and imported spices, another marker of exactly how far a household's wealth and status could remove it from the common, shared textures of everyday English life. I want to step slightly outside the story now, just for a few minutes, and talk about what actually survives from this world into ours, because I find it genuinely moving to think about, and I suspect you might too. Almost nothing remains of houses like our cottage. Wattle and daub, however well maintained, simply does not endure the way stone or brick does, and rural cottages of this humbler construction were, across the following centuries, rebuilt, replaced, or simply allowed to collapse and return to the earth their materials had come from in the first place. What we know about households like our cottage woman's comes not from standing buildings we can walk through today, but from archaeology, from careful excavation of house sites that reveals post holes and hearth locations, and the occasional preserved fragment of pottery or tool, and from documentary sources, wills, parish records, the occasional detailed household inventory that survived by chance in some local archive, pieced together by historians into the kind of composite picture we have been building together tonight. The manor houses fare rather differently, and this itself tells its own story about wealth and permanence. Many genuinely substantial Tudor manor houses do survive, some still lived in by descendants of the same families, many others preserved as museums or historic sites open to public visiting, their timber frames and brick walls and long galleries still standing, still walkable, in a way the cottage never could be. If you have ever visited a genuine Tudor house, walked through a surviving Great Hall, looked up at timber roof beams that some skilled carpenter's hands actually shaped 500 years ago, you have touched, in the most literal physical sense, something that our Isabel would have recognized completely, while the world our cottage woman inhabited survives only in trace, in record, in the patient reconstructive work of historians and archaeologists working from fragments. I think there is something worth sitting with in that asymmetry, honestly. It means that our instinctive sense of what Tudor England actually looked like, shaped as it inevitably is by which buildings survive to be visited and photographed and filmed for television dramas, skews quite heavily toward the manors version of this century rather than the cottages, even though the cottages version was, by any honest accounting of population numbers, the far more common, far more representative Tudor experience. Most people in this century were not Isabel. Most people were the woman on her knees at 4 a.m, feeling for a coal in cold ash, and yet her house, her world, her daily texture survives to us far more faintly than the world of the household that employed people like her. Let us think for a moment, too, about how these two lives actually compared in their basic length and shape, because it is easy to assume wealth simply bought a longer, safer life across the board, and the truth once again resists that simple assumption in interesting ways. Life expectancy figures from this period, when historians attempt to calculate them, are heavily skewed downward by genuinely catastrophic rates of infant and child mortality that affected every social class, though not in perfectly equal measure. A child born into either household faced real, substantial risk of not surviving to adulthood at all. Disease-claiming children with a ruthlessness that respected wealth only partially, better nutrition and warmer housing in the manor providing some genuine protective advantage, but nothing approaching the reliable safety we would now expect. For those who survived childhood's particular dangers, adult life expectancy in both households while without much doubt shorter on average than what we would now consider normal, was not quite as dramatically brief as the raw population statistics, dragged down by that infant mortality, might initially suggest. A person reaching their 20s in either household had real, reasonable prospects of living into their 50s or 60s, particularly if they avoided the specific catastrophic risks, plague, sweating sickness, the genuine dangers of childbirth for women that could claim a life at any age regardless of how carefully a person otherwise tended their health. Isabel's greater resources brought her better nutrition across most years, warmer winters, faster access to whatever medical attention this century's limited understanding could provide, and these advantages likely did translate into some genuine, if modest, statistical benefit across a full lifetime. But the gap was never as absolute as the difference in comfort between these two households might lead you to expect. Another quiet reminder that this world's fundamental dangers, disease chief among them, operated according to a logic that money could soften but never fully overrule. Let us shift the season now, away from the winter and early spring mornings we have mostly been dwelling inside, and picture instead a day in late summer, harvest time, because this particular stretch of the calendar reshaped both our households more dramatically than almost any other single period of the year, and it deserves its own careful attention before we let this whole story settle toward its close. Harvest, for the cottage family and for the entire rural community surrounding them, represented the single most labor-intensive and genuinely urgent period of the entire agricultural year. Grain, once ripe, could not simply wait for a convenient moment to be gathered. Weather threatened constantly. A sudden storm capable of flattening a standing crop or rotting cut grain left lying in a wet field, and so the entire community mobilized in these weeks with an intensity that even our cottage woman's ordinarily demanding daily labor did not usually require. Men and women worked the fields together during harvest in a way the rest of the year's more gender-divided labor did not always demand. Cutting grain with sickles, an implement requiring real skill and considerable physical stamina to use effectively hour after hour, bent forward, the sun genuinely hot on their backs, the work continuing from first proper light until the failing evening finally made it too dangerous to keep swinging a sharp blade near other people's hands and legs. Our cottage woman, during harvest, likely spent her own days in the fields alongside everyone else the household could contribute, leaving whatever domestic tasks could possibly wait until evening or the next available moment, because the harvest's urgency simply overrode almost every other ordinary priority for these particular weeks. Children old enough to contribute meaningfully worked too, gleaning the fields after the main cutting for whatever grain the sickles had missed, a task suited to smaller hands and patient attention, every single gathered stalk mattering genuinely to a household whose winter survival depended on this exact harvest's full, complete gathering. The manor's harvest looked different in its particular texture, though sharing the same fundamental urgency underneath. Isabel's household did not typically labor in the fields themselves, that work falling to the tenant farmers and laborers who worked the estate's agricultural land, sometimes including families quite similar to our cottage household, working land they held under various tenancy arrangements from the manor itself. But the manor's role in harvest was far from passive. The household's provisioning for the entire coming year depended on this same successful gathering, and Isabel and her steward would have monitored the harvest's progress with real close attention, arranging storage, calculating what portion of the harvest belonged to the estate directly, and what portion tenants retained under whatever specific arrangements governed their particular holdings, a genuinely complex web of obligation and exchange that structured rural England's entire agricultural economy throughout this century. Harvest home, the celebration marking the successful completion of this demanding period, brought communities together again in something like the feast day spirit we described earlier. A final sheaf of grain sometimes carried in with particular ceremony, ancient customs and small superstitions attached to this moment that stretched back centuries before anyone in either household had been born. A genuine, deeply felt relief running through the entire community that this year's essential gathering had been completed successfully, that the coming winter, whatever hardships it would still truly bring, would not also carry the specific terror of an unharvested or ruined crop hanging over every subsequent cold month. I find something genuinely moving in imagining this moment. Honestly, the particular quality of relief and gratitude that must have moved through an entire community simultaneously, cottage families and manor households and everyone between them, all having spent these weeks oriented toward exactly the same shared urgent goal, even while their specific labor within that goal and their specific stake in its success differed so considerably. Harvest was, perhaps, the one point in the entire yearly cycle where the whole rural community's fortunes were most visibly, most undeniably bound together, wealth and poverty alike depending on the same fields, the same weather, the same successful gathering, before the year's rhythm carried everyone back toward their more separate, more hierarchically distinct ordinary lives once the grain was safely stored and the celebration's music had faded into the season's next demands. Let us think about what gets passed down mother to daughter in each of these households, because this quiet transmission of skill and knowledge runs underneath everything we have described tonight, rarely named directly but present in every single task we have watched these women perform. Our cottage woman's daughter, whichever of her children happens to be a girl, learns fire building not through any formal instruction but through years of simple proximity, watching her mother's hands work flint and steel in the dark morning after morning until the motion becomes eventually her own hand's motion too, absorbed so thoroughly that she will likely never remember a specific moment of being taught. Only a gradual dawning capability that arrived, it will seem to her, almost on its own. The same holds true for every other skill this household depends on. Spinning, the particular judgment required to know when pottage has cooked long enough, the recognition of which wild herbs growing along the hedgerow can treat a fever, and which merely look similar but carry no such benefit, knowledge that a single wrong identification could genuinely harm rather than help. This is an education without books, without formal lessons, without anyone ever standing back and declaring a curriculum, and yet it is genuinely comprehensive, genuinely rigorous in its own way, preparing a daughter with real thoroughness for the specific demands the rest of her own life will make of her. Marriage, for this daughter, will likely happen sometime in her early 20s, a Tudor pattern that actually surprises many people who assume incorrectly that everyone in this period married in their mid-teens. Among the rural poor especially, marriage often waited until a young woman had spent several years in service herself, earning and saving toward whatever small household goods a new marriage would require, gaining practical experience beyond her own mother's house that would make her a more capable partner in establishing a household of her own. Her marriage, when it happens, will likely be to someone from a broadly similar social position, a match negotiated with real practical consideration for whether the joining of these two young people's skills and small resources could plausibly sustain a household, love and genuine affection, really playing their part in many cases, but rarely functioning as the sole or even primary consideration driving the match. Isabel's daughter faces an entirely different set of transmitted expectations, though the underlying pattern, careful preparation for a specific anticipated future, holds true in its own way. Her education in needlework, in household management, in whatever music or reading her particular family valued, prepares her explicitly for a marriage that will likely happen younger than the cottage daughters, sometimes considerably younger, negotiated not primarily between the young couple themselves, but between their two families, with real attention paid to the alliance the marriage would create, the dowry Isabel's family could offer, the standing and prospects of whatever family might provide a suitable husband. This negotiation could stretch across years, involving lawyers and detailed financial settlements, the daughter herself often having relatively limited direct say in the final choice, though the degree of genuine parental consultation and care for a daughter's own preferences varied considerably from family to family, and should not be flattened into a single uniform picture of purely cold, transactional arrangement. Some Tudor parents genuinely cared about their daughter's happiness within whatever match they arranged, seeking a husband they believed would treat their child well even while the marriage itself remained, At its structural core, a calculated alliance between families rather than what we would now think of as primarily a romantic decision made freely by the two people most directly involved. And here once more, that persistent paradox running through this entire evening returns in its final form. The cottage daughter marrying later, marrying someone closer to her own social standing, chosen with somewhat more room for her own preference and consent within the practical constraints her family's poverty still imposed, in some ways experiences a marriage negotiation with more genuine personal agency than Isabel's daughter, whose family's greater wealth and status paradoxically narrows, rather than widens, the space available for her own individual choice in one of the most significant decisions of her entire life. Wealth, across this whole evening, has brought comfort, has brought warmth, has brought considerable protection from certain hardships. It has never quite brought freedom in any simple, uncomplicated sense, and there is something worth sitting with in that, something that complicates any easy story we might otherwise want to tell ourselves about which of these two lives in the end was actually the better one to live. Let us slow down even further now, because I want to spend some time simply sitting inside the physical texture of these two houses without pushing the story forward very much at all, just dwelling in the actual furniture, the actual objects, the actual feel of these spaces the way a person living inside them would have experienced them without ever thinking to describe it. The cottage's few pieces of furniture were built to last, because replacement, when a chair or table finally failed beyond repair, meant real expense and real inconvenience. A single main table, likely constructed from oak or elm by a local carpenter, its surface worn smooth and slightly uneven from years of scrubbing and constant use, dominates whatever floor space the main room offers. Stools rather than chairs provide most of the seating, simple three-legged constructions that a reasonably capable household member could build or repair themselves, without needing a specialist's skill. Chairs with backs being, in this century, still something of a status marker, reserved often for the head of household alone, rather than provided generously to every family member. Storage exists in the form of a single chest, perhaps two if the household's modest prosperity allowed for it, holding whatever clothing and linens the family owned beyond what was currently being worn, along with any small valued possessions, a piece of jewellery passed down through a mother's line perhaps, a few coins saved carefully for genuine emergency rather than everyday spending, tools too valuable to leave lying loose. This chest, its wood darkened by years of handling and the general smoky atmosphere of the room around it, likely represents one of the household's single most valuable pieces of property. Its lock, if it possessed one at all, a genuine point of security in a house whose door itself offered only that simple wooden bar for protection. Bedding, beyond the straw pallet we mentioned earlier, might include a simple wooden bed frame if the household's means stretched that far, raised at least slightly off the cold floor, though many cottage households through much of this century still slept on pallets laid directly on the ground, the straw within refreshed periodically as it flattened and grew stale with use. Wool blankets, precious and carefully maintained, provided the family's primary defense against winter's cold, supplemented sometimes with a coverlet made from whatever fabric scraps the household's textile work had produced over the years, patched together into something that provided at least a little additional warmth even if its patchwork appearance reflected nothing resembling deliberate decorative choice. Now let us cross that same quarter mile once more into Isabel's world, and let the contrast in furniture and object tell its own quiet story alongside everything else we have already traced tonight. The great hall's furnishings alone would represent, in monetary value, more than the cottage family's entire household possessions combined many times over. Long oak tables, considerably finer in craftsmanship than the cottage's single worn surface, carved perhaps along their edges, their wood selected and worked by craftsmen whose entire livelihood depended on serving exactly this kind of wealthy clientele. Chairs, genuine chairs with backs and arms, occupy the high table specifically, their relative scarcity throughout the room itself a quiet reminder of exactly how status and seating arrangement mapped onto each other throughout this entire century. Tapestries hang along the hall's walls. We mentioned their insulating function earlier, but their visual and textural presence deserves its own moment of attention too. Woven scenes often depicting hunting parties, mythological subjects, or biblical narratives, their colours rich where the cottage's undyed wool offers only the natural tones of the fibre itself, their surface catching and holding candlelight in a way that transforms the hall's evening atmosphere into something the cottage's bare timber walls could never quite achieve. These tapestries, imported often from skilled workshops on the continent, represented investment on a scale that dwarfs almost anything else we have discussed tonight, sometimes costing more than an entire modest house's total construction expense. Isabel's own private chamber holds objects of a more intimate, personal character. A proper bed with its curtains and featherbed we described earlier, a small writing desk where her household accounts and correspondence receive their careful attention, perhaps a small collection of books, genuinely valuable and genuinely rare possessions in this century, before printing had yet made books anything like the affordable common objects they would eventually become. A book of hours, perhaps, its illuminated pages combining religious devotion with genuine artistic beauty, or a volume of poetry, or practical texts on household management and herbal remedies that a woman in her position might consult alongside the older, purely oral knowledge traditions that still shaped so much of this century's practical domestic life. Small personal items scattered through this chamber tell their own quiet stories too. A mirror, small and precious, its glass backed with metal to create reflection, a luxury the cottage woman, checking her own appearance perhaps only in still water or a polished metal surface if she checks it at all, would rarely if ever possess for herself. Jewellery kept in a small locked box, pieces that carry genuine monetary value alongside whatever personal or family significance particular items might hold. A ring perhaps given at her own marriage, a pendant that came to her through inheritance from her own mother or grandmother, physical objects carrying memory and lineage forward in a way that mirrors in its own wealthier register the far more modest inherited objects the cottage woman's own chest contains. Let us widen our view for just a few minutes, out past this particular village and this particular manor, because both these households, however local and however small their daily concerns might feel from the inside, existed within a genuinely dynamic, rapidly changing country during exactly this stretch of the 16th century, and it is worth understanding at least briefly the larger currents moving around them even if neither our cottage woman nor Isabel herself experienced those currents with much direct day-to-day awareness. London, growing rapidly through this century into one of Europe's genuinely significant cities, existed as a kind of distant gravitational presence for both households, a place neither would necessarily ever visit, though Isabel's family, depending on her husband's particular position and ambitions, might maintain some genuine connection there, a London house perhaps for the periods when court business or legal affairs required the family's presence, a level of geographic and social mobility the cottage family could simply never access. The court itself, wherever the monarch happened to be residing at any given moment, Whitehall or Hampton Court or one of the various royal residences scattered across the southeast of England, represented the absolute pinnacle of the same social hierarchy that structured everything we have described tonight, a world of display and expense that made even Isabel's considerable household seem by comparison genuinely modest. Trade too connected these local households to a far wider world than their daily lives might suggest. Threads running outward from that spice merchant's careful measurements in the manor kitchen all the way to genuinely distant ports, Antwerp and Venice serving as genuinely significant hubs through which goods from far beyond Europe's own borders eventually made their way into English kitchens and English wardrobes. The wool that clothed our cottage family in its raw, undyed, humble form, connected nonetheless to England's single most important export industry, wool and woolen cloth representing, across this entire century, the backbone of the country's international trade and ultimately a meaningful portion of the Crown's own tax revenue, meaning that even this modest cottage household's small flock, however invisible it might seem within the larger picture, participated in an economic system stretching across the entire European continent. Political change, too, moved through this century with a speed and consequence that touched both households, even if unevenly. We have already discussed the religious upheaval of Henry VIII's reign and its considerable consequences for charity and land ownership alike, the subsequent reigns of his children, the brief return toward Catholicism under Mary, the further Protestant settlement under Elizabeth that would eventually stabilize into the religious arrangement that shaped England for centuries afterward. All of this moved through parish churches and household practice in ways that both our cottage woman and Isabel would have felt directly in what forms of worship their local church now offered, in what religious images remained or had been removed from its walls, in what the priest now told them to believe about matters that had, within a single adult lifetime, shifted more than once beneath their feet. I find something genuinely striking in imagining how this must have felt from the inside, honestly, living through a period when the fundamental religious framework organizing your entire understanding of the world and the next one could shift meaningfully within your own remembered lifetime, sometimes more than once. Neither our cottage woman nor Isabel chose these changes, both adapted to them as best they could, attending whatever form of service their parish now offered, raising their children within whatever framework currently held official sanction, carrying forward, underneath all of it, the same daily rhythms of fire and food and family that this entire evening has been tracing, rhythms that proved, in the end, considerably more stable and more continuous than the religious and political structures technically governing the century around them. Let us come back now to the very edge of morning, because there is something fitting in closing where we began, at that particular hour just before dawn, when the whole cycle we have spent this evening tracing begins again exactly as it did the day before, and the day before that, stretching backward and forward across this entire century in a rhythm that neither wealth nor poverty ever fully interrupted. In the cottage, our woman will wake again in a few hours to that same cold hearth, will feel again along the ash for a living coal, will begin again the long chain of labour that fills every single one of her days with a thoroughness that leaves very little room for anything we would now recognise as leisure or rest during the daylight hours themselves. And yet within that relentless demand there existed, we have seen tonight, genuine moments of warmth, genuine competence taken quiet pride in, genuine community found in shared feast days and harvest celebrations, a life that modern comfort would find almost unbearably hard, but that this woman herself, knowing no other possibility, experienced with whatever mixture of hardship and satisfaction any full human life actually contains, regardless of the century or the circumstances surrounding it. Isabel in the manor will wake to a fire already built, will move through her own version of this same underlying rhythm, dressing with her servants' help, managing her household's considerable practical complexity, navigating the social obligations her family's position demands of her, with a skill built from years of careful attention and practice. Her comfort was real. Her constraints, we have also seen tonight, were equally real. A life spent largely within careful, managed performance, wealth that bought warmth and fine food and genuine physical ease while never quite buying the freedom to simply live as she might otherwise have chosen for herself, had the accident of her birth placed her somewhere else within this same rigid social structure. Between these two households, this quarter-mile of English countryside contained, in miniature, almost the entire range of experience available to a woman living through this particular century, from the coldest, hardest physical labour to the most carefully cushioned material comfort, and yet running underneath both of these very different lives, the same essential human rhythms persisted unbroken, waking and working and resting, feeding children and worrying over their health, finding whatever small moments of genuine warmth and connection each day's structure allowed for, moving through a religious calendar that gave shape and meaning to an otherwise relentless yearly cycle of labor, and finally, each night, surrendering to a darkness neither wealth nor poverty could do anything at all to soften or resist. I think that is, in the end, the thing I most want to leave you with tonight. The thing that sits underneath everything else we have explored across this whole evening together. The houses were different. The fires were different. One built by cold, cracked hands in choking smoke. The other built by a servant so that warmth would simply be waiting, already prepared, invisible in its labor. The food was different. The clothing was different. The very air these two households breathed carried different smells, different textures, different qualities of light filtering through glass or through a simple wooden shutter. And yet both households were full of people who loved their children, who worried about the coming winter, who found genuine comfort in small daily rituals repeated until they became almost invisible through sheer familiarity, who looked forward to feast days and harvest celebrations, who fell asleep each night carrying whatever particular weight their own particular life had handed them that day. The hidden houses of Tudor England were never really hidden from the people who lived inside them. They were hidden only from us, from the comfortable distance of 5 centuries, until we take the time, as we have tonight, to actually step back inside them, to feel the cold hearth and the banked coal, to smell the smoke and the beeswax candle alike, to understand that history is never really about dates and kings and religious settlements alone, however much those larger currents shaped the world these people lived within. History is about a woman's hands in cold ash at 4 in the morning. It is about a servant girl building a fire for someone else's comfort before her own body has had any chance to warm itself. It is about all of it together. The whole vast, uneven, deeply human texture of an ordinary day, repeated across an entire century by people whose names mostly did not survive, but whose lives, in every essential way that matters, were every bit as full, as complicated, as genuinely felt as your own. Let us dwell a little longer on the animals that shared both these households' daily rhythms, because livestock in this century occupied a role considerably more intimate and considerably more central to survival than most modern households would ever experience with the animals in their own lives now. The cottage's animals, however few, represented genuine, carefully protected wealth. A single cow providing milk that could be turned into cheese and butter, extending the household's access to dairy protein across a much longer stretch of the year than fresh milk alone could ever manage. Chickens, kept for both eggs and, eventually, meat, required daily attention, feeding, protection from predators, a coop or simple enclosure that needed maintaining against weather and against whatever fox or other wild animal might otherwise take advantage of an unguarded flock overnight. The pig, where a household could manage to keep one, held a particularly significant place in the cottage's yearly rhythm, fattened through spring and summer and into autumn on whatever scraps and foraged food the household could provide, before its slaughter, typically timed to coincide with the year's first genuinely cold weather, when the resulting meat could be properly preserved through salting and smoking without immediate risk of spoilage. This slaughter, when it happened, represented a genuinely significant event in the household's year, every part of the animal processed with the careful, thorough attention we mentioned earlier, nothing wasted, the resulting preserved meat stretching the family's protein access across months that would otherwise offer almost none at all. Our cottage woman's relationship with these animals carried a practical, unsentimental quality that might strike modern sensibilities as somewhat cold, though it would be a mistake to assume this meant genuine indifference or cruelty. She knew these animals individually, understood their particular temperaments and needs, likely felt something we might recognize as real affection toward at least some of them, particularly a milk cow that might remain part of the household for many years, becoming, in its own way, a familiar and valued presence. But this affection existed alongside a clear-eyed practical understanding that the household's survival depended on these animals' productive value, an understanding that made the eventual slaughter of a pig, however carefully raised, simply part of the expected, necessary rhythm of rural life rather than any kind of moral crisis requiring resolution. The manor's relationship with animals operated on a considerably larger and more varied scale. Beyond the horses essential for transportation and hunting that we mentioned earlier, and the hounds kept specifically for the chase, a household of real size might maintain considerable livestock of its own on the estates surrounding farmland, managed not directly by the family but by dedicated herdsmen and farm workers whose entire livelihood depended on this specific responsibility. Dovecotes, a genuinely distinctive feature of wealthier Tudor estates, provided a steady supply of young pigeon meat considered a genuine delicacy. The birds themselves housed in elaborate, sometimes architecturally impressive structures built specifically for this purpose, another small but telling marker of exactly how far a wealthy household's resources could extend even into what might seem, at first glance, a fairly minor category of food production. Fish ponds, too, appear on many wealthy estates of this period. Artificial ponds stocked and carefully managed to provide fresh fish, particularly valuable given the dietary restrictions around meat we discussed earlier during Lent and other fasting periods throughout the church calendar. Managing these ponds required genuine specialized knowledge, understanding fish breeding cycles, water quality, the particular management techniques needed to maintain a healthy harvestable population across years of careful tending. Knowledge that, like so much else we have discussed tonight, existed as specialized labor performed by dedicated staff specifically so that the family itself need never engage with the actual demanding work involved. Let us return one final time to candles and light, because we touched on this earlier, but I think it deserves a slightly deeper look, given how completely artificial light shaped, or rather limited, the actual working hours available to every single person in this century, regardless of their household's wealth. Candle making itself in the cottage represented another of those quiet, essential skills our woman carried within her hands. Tallow rendered from animal fat saved specifically for this purpose, melted slowly and carefully because fat can scorch or catch fire if heated too quickly or too carelessly, then either dipped repeatedly around a wick to build up successive thin layers, a process requiring real patience and many repeated dippings to produce a candle of any useful thickness, or poured into simple molds if the household happened to own any, producing a more uniform result with somewhat less labor per candle. The resulting tallow candles burned with a dim yellowish, distinctly smoky flame, and carried a smell that most modern noses would find genuinely unpleasant, a faintly meaty, slightly rancid quality that came directly from the animal fat forming the candle's entire substance. Our cottage household used these candles sparingly, aware of exactly how much labor and how much of their limited store of animal fat each one represented, saving their use for genuine necessity rather than casual convenience. Most evening hours instead simply surrendered to whatever firelight the hearth itself provided, supplemented perhaps by a rushlight for a specific close task that demanded slightly better illumination than the fire alone could offer. Rushlights themselves deserve a moment's specific attention, because they represent perhaps the cheapest form of artificial light available to any Tudor household, made from the pith of rush plants, a common wetland grass, peeled carefully to expose the absorbent inner core, then dipped in whatever fat or grease the household had available, even kitchen scraps too poor in quality for cooking use but still perfectly serviceable for this purpose. A rushlight burned only briefly, often less than half an hour for a single prepared length, requiring frequent replacement or a household member specifically tending the flame, but its cost in terms of the household's limited resources sat low enough that even the poorest cottage could usually manage at least a few for the darkest, most necessary evening tasks. The manor's relationship with light, we discussed earlier, extended into beeswax candles for its finest rooms and occasions, But it is worth understanding just how genuinely significant an expense candles represented even for a wealthy household across an entire year, because burning candles in real quantity, sufficient to light a great hall or several private chambers through long winter evenings, consumed resources that appear, in surviving household accounts from grand estates of this period, as one of the more substantial recurring expenses a family of real means needed to budget for carefully. This helps explain why even Isabel's household, despite its considerable wealth relative to the cottage, still organized much of its own daily and evening rhythm around available daylight, rather than simply burning candles freely and continuously regardless of the hour. A habit of mind shaped by centuries of genuine scarcity that not even considerable wealth could fully dissolve. I find something worth noticing in that fact too, honestly. The way even genuine prosperity in this century still operated within limits that would strike us now as remarkably constrained. Isabel could afford considerably more candlelight than our cottage woman, could extend her evenings somewhat further into genuine darkness before need finally forced sleep upon her. But she could not simply banish night the way electric light allows almost anyone now, wealthy or poor, to do with the flip of a switch. The fundamental rhythm of daylight and darkness in this respect governed both these households far more similarly than almost anything else we have traced across this entire evening. A shared human experience of night's genuine, unavoidable weight that modern life for most of us has quietly and almost completely erased from our own daily awareness. Let us step outside both houses for a few final minutes, out into the countryside that surrounded and connected them, because the landscape itself deserves some attention before we let this whole evening settle toward its close. England in this century looked, in many genuine respects, quite different from the countryside you might picture now. The enclosure movement that would eventually reshape so much of rural England into the neat hedge-bordered fields familiar from later paintings and photographs, still only partially underway during these particular decades, meaning that much of the landscape our two households moved through retained a more open, communally worked character. Great unenclosed fields divided not by hedges but by simple markers, strips of land worked by different households according to old, established patterns of shared agricultural rights that stretched back through many previous generations. Woodland, too, held a different relationship to both households than we might now assume, not simply wild, untouched forest, but carefully managed resource, coppiced and maintained according to techniques that provided a steady, renewable supply of wood for fuel and construction across generations, without ever fully depleting the resource the way purely extractive logging eventually would in less carefully managed regions. Our cottage families' access to this woodland, whether through customary rights attached to their particular holding, or through more restricted arrangements requiring payment or permission from whoever held the land, shaped directly how much fuel they could gather for their own hearth, another quiet thread connecting the physical landscape itself to that same fire we began this whole evening beside. The paths and roads connecting village to manor to market town were, by modern standards, genuinely rough, often little more than dirt tracks that turned to considerable mud during wet weather, making travel even across relatively short distances a real physical undertaking rather than the effortless convenience we now take almost entirely for granted. Our cottage woman's walk to market, the distance we mentioned earlier, represented genuine physical effort and genuine time investment, hours rather than minutes, weather dependent, requiring a level of physical capability and endurance that modern life, for most of us, simply never demands with anything like this same regularity. Sound itself, across this landscape, differed genuinely from what surrounds most of us now. No engine noise anywhere, obviously, but also considerably less of almost every other kind of background noise modern life generates without our even noticing it anymore. Birdsong carried further and more clearly across open fields. The particular quality of genuine, deep quiet that settled over this countryside at night, broken only by wind and owl call and the occasional distant sound of another household's animals, represents an experience of silence that almost nobody living now, surrounded by however faint and constant a hum of modern technology, has ever fully known for even a single complete night. I think there is something worth carrying forward from this landscape as we finally let this whole story settle towards sleep. The sheer physical presence of a world built almost entirely from natural materials, wood and stone and earth and woven plant fiber, worked by human hands into shelter and warmth and food, without a single piece of plastic, without a single electric light, without any of the countless small conveniences that surround almost every one of us now so completely that we rarely even notice their presence anymore. Both our households, however different their comfort and their wealth, inhabited this same fundamentally handmade world together, a world where every single object surrounding them, every garment, every tool, every piece of furniture had passed through actual human hands and actual human skill before it could exist at all. Let us think for a few final minutes about what genuine rest actually meant within these two households, because I think this particular question sits closest to why we spend our own evenings here together in the first place. For our cottage woman, rest arrived rarely as any kind of deliberate, chosen activity separate from sleep itself. The closest she came to genuine daytime rest might be a brief pause taken while nursing an infant, a few minutes sitting rather than standing while some other task, spinning perhaps, continued alongside it, or the particular stillness of a Sunday afternoon following church, when custom and in many periods actual law restricted certain kinds of labor, creating a narrow window of legitimate pause within an otherwise unrelenting weekly rhythm. Sleep itself, for this household, sometimes followed a pattern that historians have found genuinely interesting to trace through surviving records and later folklore, a pattern some scholars call segmented or biphasic sleep, where a household might wake briefly in the deep middle of the night, a period sometimes referred to in surviving texts as the watch, or the first sleep giving way to a waking interval before a second sleep carried the household through toward dawn. During this middle waking period, quiet activities might fill an hour or so, a little conversation, perhaps prayer, perhaps simply lying awake in the dark, before sleep reclaimed the body again. This pattern, largely erased from most modern experience by artificial light's ability to push our own evenings later and compress our sleep into a single continuous block, offers a genuinely different relationship with night than most of us now carry, one where waking in darkness was not experienced as insomnia or disruption, but simply as an ordinary, expected part of how a full night's rest naturally unfolded. Isabel's household likely experienced this same segmented pattern too. Sleep in this century shaped more by the body's own natural rhythms responding to genuine darkness than by any of the artificial cues, screens and electric light and rigid alarm-driven schedules that shape and often disrupt so much modern sleep now. Her greater comfort, her warmer chamber, her softer bed, in truth shaped the particular quality of her rest, but the underlying structure, sleep broken by a waking interval before resuming again toward morning, likely held true across both households, in ways that connect them more closely than almost anything else we have traced tonight. I want you to sit with that thought for just a moment actually, because I think it might be the single most useful thing this whole evening has to offer you personally right now, wherever you happen to be lying as you listen to this. If you find yourself waking briefly in the middle of the night, restless, uncertain why sleep has released its grip earlier than you expected, know that you are experiencing something genuinely old, something both our cottage woman and Isabel herself would have recognized completely, an ordinary rhythm of human rest that modern life has simply taught us, incorrectly, to treat as a problem requiring solution rather than accepting as the perfectly natural texture sleep has always actually carried for bodies living without electric light's constant, artificial insistence that night can be pushed back and compressed and controlled. Let us return one more time to bread, because I think it makes a fitting place to linger before we finally let this whole evening close, given how completely bread anchored the diet of both these households despite every other difference we have traced between them tonight. The actual process of baking in the cottage depended entirely on whether the household possessed its own oven or relied instead on a shared communal oven, often maintained by the village or by whoever held the manor's baking rights, a genuine point of local social and economic organization that determined how and when an individual household could actually bake its own bread. Where a communal oven served the village, baking days followed a set schedule, households bringing their prepared dough on the appointed day to take advantage of the oven's heat once it had been properly built up, often by the baker or whoever managed the oven burning a substantial fire directly inside the oven's chamber for hours beforehand, then raking out the ash and coals once the stone or brick structure had absorbed enough heat to bake bread purely through that retained warmth, without any direct flame touching the loaves themselves. This system meant our cottage woman's bread-making rhythm depended partly on a schedule outside her own household's control, requiring her dough to be properly prepared and ready exactly when the shared oven's turn arrived. A small but real example of how thoroughly this century's rural life depended on cooperation and shared resource, even within an economy that, in so many other ways, left each individual household fending largely for itself, needing itself. When the moment came demanded real physical strength, dough worked by hand for a sustained period, developing the gluten structure that would allow the bread to rise properly and hold its shape through baking, a task made more difficult by the coarser flour our cottage household typically used, rye and barley and sometimes ground peas mixed in when wheat ran short, producing a dough considerably less cooperative and considerably harder to work than the fine, pale wheat flour the manor's kitchen enjoyed in comparative abundance. The kneading itself, repeated push and fold and turn, done against a wooden surface or a simple table, left flour dust settling into the room's air, catching whatever light filtered through the doorway or the small window. A small, quiet, almost beautiful detail easy to overlook amid everything else this labour demanded. The manor's baking, by contrast, happened within its own dedicated space, sometimes a separate bakehouse entirely, staffed by someone whose specific role centred on exactly this task, producing bread in genuinely large quantities to feed the entire household we described earlier. The fine manchet for the high table, the coarser cheat bread for the wider staff, baked in ovens built and maintained specifically for this continuous large-scale production, rather than the more occasional, communally scheduled baking our cottage family depended on. The smell of this baking, rich and warm and yeasty, would have drifted through much of the manor's ground floor on baking days, a genuinely pleasant sensory experience that both households, in their own way and their own proportion, would have recognized and I think genuinely enjoyed, whatever else divided the actual bread each eventually placed on their very different tables. There is something quietly moving, I think, in ending our exploration of food here with bread, because bread connected every single person in this century, wealthy and poor alike, in a way almost nothing else we have discussed tonight quite manages. Everyone ate bread. Everyone depended on grain, on harvest, on the whole long chain of labour from field to flour to finished loaf that we have traced tonight in its many different forms. The quality differed enormously, the quantity differed enormously, but the basic human need and the basic human comfort found in warm bread fresh from an oven connected our cottage woman and Isabel far more closely than either of them, going about their very separate days, likely ever paused to consider. Let us think finally about the stories these households told each other, because oral tradition filled the evening hours of both cottage and manor in ways that connect directly to why we ourselves are spending this particular evening together right now, listening to a story meant to ease you gently toward your own rest. Our cottage family gathered close around the hearth in that last hour before sleep we described earlier, likely passed many evenings with exactly this kind of storytelling, tales inherited from previous generations, folk stories featuring clever animals and foolish giants, and the particular local legends attached to a nearby hill or stream or ancient tree that every child in the village grew up knowing by heart. These stories served purposes beyond simple entertainment, though entertainment beyond doubt mattered too, especially on long winter evenings when the alternative to a good story was simply sitting in near total darkness with nothing to occupy the mind. Many carried practical wisdom folded into their narrative structure, warnings about wandering too far from home after dark, lessons about honesty or kindness rewarded and cruelty eventually punished, a kind of moral education delivered through narrative rather than direct instruction, the same technique in its own way that this very video has been using with you tonight, wrapping information and reflection inside story rather than simply listing facts at you directly. Isabel's household enjoyed its own version of this same storytelling tradition, though supplemented, for a family of her means, by the additional resource of actual written literature, romances and religious texts, and, as the century progressed, an increasing range of printed material becoming available as the printing press's impact spread more widely through English society. Her children, before sleep, might hear a story read aloud from an actual book rather than recited purely from memory, though the oral folk tradition, shared broadly across every social class in this century, likely still filled many of their evenings too. Nurses and household staff, carrying the same stories our cottage family knew into the nursery of even the wealthiest homes. I find something genuinely lovely in this particular point of connection. Honestly, the idea that a story about a clever fox outwitting a foolish wolf, or a tale explaining why a particular local spring never freezes even in the hardest winter, might have been told, on the very same evening, in almost identical form, both beside our cottage's smoky hearth, and within Isabel's grand and comfortable chamber, carried by voice and memory across every boundary of wealth and status that otherwise divided these two households so completely. Story, it turns out, moved more freely across this century's rigid social hierarchy than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, indifferent to chimney or candle wax or imported spice, requiring nothing more than a voice, a listener, and the shared human need, felt just as strongly in a cold cottage as in a warm manor chamber, for a good story to ease the mind gently towards sleep at the close of a long day. Let us watch, one final time, the turning of the year itself across both these households, because spring, when it finally arrived after the long hardship of winter we described earlier, brought its own particular relief that both cottage and manor felt in their own distinct registers. For our cottage family, spring meant the garden could finally be worked again, new growth pushing up through soil that had sat frozen and unproductive for months, the first tender greens available to supplement a winter diet that had, by this point in the year, grown genuinely monotonous, the same preserved and stored foods repeated meal after meal until fresh growth finally offered something different. The animals, too, marked this seasonal shift, lambing and calving happening through these early spring weeks, new life arriving that represented both genuine joy, the particular pleasure of watching young animals move unsteadily through their first days, and genuine practical significance because these new animals represented the household's hope for the coming year's continued survival and, if fortune allowed, some modest growth in the family's very limited store of wealth. Our cottage woman's daily rhythm shifted with the seasonal change too. Longer daylight hours, meaning longer working days, became possible, though also, inevitably, longer working days actually required, because spring planting demanded exactly this kind of extended urgent labor before the narrow window for successful sowing closed again for another year. Isabel's household experienced this same seasonal shift with its own particular inflection, Isabel's household grounds coming back to life, the knot gardens we described earlier requiring their own spring attention as new growth needed shaping and directing back into the precise geometric patterns fashion demanded. Hunting season too shifted with the year's turning, different game becoming available or restricted according to the particular customs and legal restrictions governing exactly when different animals could be legitimately pursued. A calendar Isabel's household understood with real precision, another small marker of the specialized knowledge that came bundled together with the privilege of legal hunting access itself. And so the year continued turning, spring giving way to the demanding labor of summer, summer surrendering to harvest's particular urgency, harvest settling into autumn's preparation for winter's return, the whole cycle repeating itself across every single year of both these households' lives, across every year of this entire century. A rhythm so fundamental and so unbroken that neither our cottage woman nor Isabel likely ever paused to consider it as anything other than simply the shape the world naturally took, the way a fish presumably never pauses to consider the water surrounding it as anything other than simply the basic, unremarkable medium its entire existence unfolds within. Before we let this evening close completely, I want to spend just a few more minutes on something we have touched only briefly tonight: the particular texture of a Tudor washing day, because I think it deserves a fuller telling than the earlier mention gave it. Picture the morning our cottage woman has decided the household's linen genuinely cannot wait any longer, the shirts and shifts and the few precious sheets grown grey enough, with weeks of accumulated wear, that even her own considerable tolerance for practical dirt has finally reached its limit. This is not a task she takes on lightly, because it will consume the entire day ahead, and likely draw in whatever help a neighbouring woman or an older daughter can offer, the two of them working together at the stream's edge or around a large pot set to boil over an outdoor fire built specifically for this purpose, because heating enough water indoors for a genuine laundry day would demand more fuel than the household's stores could easily spare. The linens go in first to soak, sometimes overnight, in a mixture of water and the harsh lye soap made from wood ash, and the smell of this mixture, sharp and faintly acrid, settles over the whole work area in a way that clings to hands and clothing for hours afterward. Once soaked, each piece gets scrubbed by hand, worked against a washing board's ridged surface, or simply against smooth stones if the household lacks a proper board. Knuckles reddening quickly in water that, however carefully warmed, cools rapidly in the open air, especially on a day when the season has not yet turned fully towards summer's gentler weather. Heaviest of all are the sheets, requiring two people working together simply to manage the wet weight involved. One woman holding one end while the other twists and wrings from the opposite direction. A technique that gets considerably more water out than either woman working alone could manage, though it still leaves the fabric heavy enough that carrying it to wherever it will dry represents its own small physical trial. And then finally the laying out, draped across hedges and low branches and whatever ropes the household has managed to string between fixed points, left to catch whatever sun and wind the day provides. Watched anxiously if clouds gather, because a sudden shower at the wrong moment could mean starting significant portions of this exhausting process over again from the beginning. By evening, if the weather has cooperated, the household's linens hang clean and pale, smelling of fresh air and sun, in a way that represents, for however brief a period before daily use begins accumulating grime again, one of this household's genuine small pleasures, a satisfaction earned through an entire day's difficult, unglamorous labour that our cottage woman would never think to describe using a word as grand as satisfaction, though satisfaction in its own quiet, embodied way is very much what this feeling actually was. There is one more small world within this larger story worth stepping into before we finally let everything settle, and that is the particular experience of a Tudor Sunday, because it interrupted the otherwise relentless working rhythm of both households in ways worth understanding fully. Church attendance, as we mentioned earlier, carried genuine legal weight, but the day itself offered something beyond mere obligation, a structured pause that both cottage and manor genuinely needed, whatever their differing reasons for needing it. Our cottage woman's Sunday still began early. Animals still required tending regardless of what day the calendar declared, but the heaviest labour, the spinning and the field work and the more demanding household tasks, paused for these hours in a way that gave her body genuine rare relief. The walk to church itself, whatever the weather, brought her into contact with the wider community beyond her own immediate household, neighbours and relatives and the familiar faces of everyone within walking distance, a social dimension her working week otherwise offered only in scattered, brief moments between tasks. The service itself, conducted in whatever language and according to whatever specific religious framework this particular decade's political and religious changes currently mandated, provided something beyond spiritual instruction alone. It offered rhythm, structure, a shared experience binding the entire parish together, regardless of how differently each family within it lived through the remaining 6 days of the week. Isabel's household attended too, of course, occupying their more prominent, visible position within the church itself, but sharing for this single hour the same fundamental experience of communal worship that briefly, genuinely leveled some of the distance otherwise separating every single person gathered within those walls. Afternoons following church varied more by household temperament than by strict rule, some families permitting genuine rest and quiet recreation, others maintaining stricter expectations about how this day should properly be spent. But for both our households, Sunday represented something genuinely valuable within an otherwise unforgiving yearly rhythm, a single day each week when the demands pressing against both cottage and manor alike eased just slightly, enough to remind everyone involved that a life built entirely from labour, however necessary that labour remained, was never quite the whole of what either household actually wanted their lives to be. One last thread worth following before we close concerns the hands themselves, both women's hands, because hands tell a story in this century that faces and clothing sometimes obscure. Our cottage woman's hands, by the time she reaches middle age, carry a permanent record of everything we have described tonight: knuckles thickened from cold water, palms calloused from rope and tool handles and endless scrubbing, small scars from the countless minor cuts and burns any life this physically demanding inevitably accumulates. These hands could accomplish an extraordinary range of tasks without conscious thought, fire building and bread kneading, and the delicate precision spinning actually requires muscle memory built through literally tens of thousands of repetitions across an entire working life. Isabel's hands tell a genuinely different story, softer, less marked by direct physical labour, though not entirely idle either. Needlework leaving its own particular calluses on fingertips that guided a needle through fine linen for hours at a stretch, and the considerable physical effort of horse riding, when hunting or simply travelling demanded it, building its own kind of strength and endurance rarely visible in formal portraits designed specifically to present aristocratic hands as delicate and refined, regardless of whatever genuine capability those same hands actually possessed. I find something worth sitting with in this final comparison, because hands, more than almost anything else we have discussed across this whole evening, resist the simple story we might otherwise want to tell about these two lives. Neither woman's hands were idle. Both carried real skill, real capability, built through years of repeated practice within their own particular sphere. The cottage woman's hands could keep an entire household alive through winter's hardest months. Isabel's hands could manage a household's complex accounts, produce genuinely beautiful needlework, guide a horse across difficult terrain with real confidence and control. Different skills built for different lives, but skill nonetheless, competence nonetheless. Two women whose hands, however different their daily texture, both carried the accumulated evidence of lives fully, genuinely lived. There is a final small object worth dwelling on before we let everything settle. The well itself, standing at the edge of the village, worn stone rim smoothed by generations of hands and ropes and buckets, because it connects our cottage woman's world to something older than either household we have spent this evening inside. That well had likely been dug and maintained across many generations before her, its water drawn by her mother and her mother's mother in turn, the rope worn into a particular groove along the stone lip, through centuries of exactly the same motion, bucket lowered, water drawn, rope coiled again for the next person's turn. Isabel's household drew its own water from a source considerably closer and considerably better maintained, a well of its own within the manor grounds, or in the grandest houses, an early and often unreliable system of pipes carrying water from a nearby spring directly toward the kitchen, and certain other key points within the house, a genuine luxury that spared her household staff at least some portion of the walking and carrying our cottage family's own water gathering demanded. But even this advantage, real as it was, still required human labour somewhere in the chain. Someone maintaining the pipes, someone ensuring the source itself remained clean and reliable. Labour simply relocated rather than eliminated, exactly as we noted so many times across this whole evening's exploration. Water, in the end, connected every single person in both these households and every household across this entire century. The same rain falling on cottage roof and manor roof alike, the same rivers and springs and wells providing the same basic, essential substance that both bread and pottage and ale all ultimately depended on. Wealth changed how far a person had to walk to reach it, how much labour stood between a thirsty mouth and a filled cup, but it never changed water's fundamental necessity, never changed the basic fact that every single day, in every single household across this century, someone's hands had to do the work of bringing water from wherever it naturally gathered into wherever human need required it to be. Smell too deserves one last mention before we close, because scent carried memory and meaning across this century in ways worth honouring here at the end. A cottage woman's world smelled of wood smoke worked permanently into every fibre of her clothing and every timber of her house, of tallow and rendered fat, of the particular mineral dampness packed earth floors carry after rain, of animal warmth and wool and the sharp tang of lye soap on washing days. Isabel's world smelled differently. Beeswax and imported spice, the particular perfume of rosewater and dried lavender scattered among stored linens, the rich, warm smell of roasting meat drifting from a kitchen building considerably larger and considerably better provisioned than anything the cottage could imagine. And yet smell, like story, moved across these boundaries too, wood smoke reaching even Isabel's grandest rooms whenever a fire needed building. The same bread smell rising from both households' ovens on baking day, the same rain smell arriving through both a shuttered cottage window and a glazed manor casement whenever an English sky finally opened after days of gathering cloud. These two households breathed, in the end, the very same air, the very same English weather moving across both their roofs regardless of what those roofs were built from. And there is something worth holding on to in that final simple fact as we let this whole evening finally close. Laughter, too, belonged fully to both these households. Worth naming before we close, because it would be a mistake to let this whole evening's careful accounting of hardship and privilege obscure the simple fact that children laughed in the cottage just as freely as children laughed in the manor, that our cottage woman found genuine humour in small daily moments just as readily as Isabel did within her own more comfortable days. A child's first unsteady steps drew delight in both households. A shared joke between neighbours, a particularly clumsy moment during the harvest dance, a household dog's ridiculous antics chasing something across the yard. These small sparks of genuine pleasure and amusement threaded through both these lives constantly, unrecorded by history in any formal sense but no less real for their absence from the surviving documents historians now study to reconstruct this whole century's texture. These small pleasures rarely survive in any formal record. No will or household account bothers to note a shared laugh over spilled milk or a well-timed joke told beside a hearth. And yet I think we can trust with real confidence that they happened constantly, that both these households, whatever else divided them, were genuinely full of ordinary human warmth in exactly this small, unrecorded, thoroughly human way. And that, perhaps, is the truest thing this whole evening has offered you, the reminder that ordinary joy needs no written record to have been genuinely real, that laughter shared quietly beside a fire, whether that fire burned in a cold cottage or a warm manor chamber, mattered every bit as much to the person living inside that particular moment as anything else this whole evening has traced across these two very different, very human lives. Let us close now, gently, the way both these households eventually closed every single one of their own days, whatever the specific hour, whatever the specific texture of hardship or comfort that particular day had carried. It is very late now in our own imagined century, past midnight in both the cottage and the manor, and the whole quarter-mile of countryside separating them has settled into that particular deep, complete darkness we described earlier. broken only by the faint glow of banked coals in one house and a single low-burning candle, nearly spent now, in the other. Somewhere in the cottage, our woman sleeps the deep, dreamless sleep of genuine physical exhaustion, her children close beside her, warm enough under their mended blanket, the fire's last coals holding just enough heat to keep the room from truly freezing through these final hours before dawn calls her back to that same cold hearth again. Somewhere in the manor, Isabel sleeps too, her body considerably less spent by physical labor but no less genuinely tired. The day's careful management and performance finally set down, if only for these few private hours, her chamber warm and quiet around her, her servant resting in her own small room nearby, ready to return with morning's first light and begin the whole careful ritual of dressing and preparation once again. Between these two sleeping women, across that quarter-mile, neither of them will likely ever actually walk in the other's direction with any real social purpose. Run all the threads we have followed together tonight, the fire built with cold hands or built by someone else's earlier labor, the bread coarse or fine, the water carried in buckets by the woman herself, or delivered by a servant whose own labor remains just as real and just as demanding even though it happens beyond Isabel's direct awareness. Wealth changed everything about how these two lives felt from the inside. The warmth, the food, the clothing, the freedom from certain specific and genuine hardships. And wealth changed remarkably little about the deeper human shape both these lives actually held. The love for children, the worry over health and harvest and the coming winter, the small comfort found in a familiar story told beside a fire, the surrender every single night to a darkness that came for cottage and manor alike with exactly the same patient, unhurried inevitability. I think if there is one thing worth carrying with you from this whole evening as you finally let yourself drift toward your own sleep, it might be this. However hard your own day was, however much or however little comfort surrounded you as you moved through it, you are connected by nothing more than this simple universal need for rest to every single person who has ever lived through a long day and finally allowed themselves to stop. Our cottage woman felt this same surrender you are feeling right now, this same gradual loosening of the body's held tension as sleep finally approaches. Isabel felt it too, in her own warmer, softer version of the very same human experience. 5 centuries have passed since either of them last closed their eyes for the night, and yet this particular moment, this exact feeling of a body finally allowing itself to rest after a day of genuine effort, has not changed at all, has been passed down unbroken through every single night between their century and this one, arriving now in this quiet moment to you. The fire in the cottage will need building again in just a few hours. The manor's servants will rise before their mistress does, tending fires and preparing warmth she will wake into without ever quite seeing the labor that made it possible. But that is tomorrow's work, tomorrow's cycle beginning again exactly as it has every single day across this entire century we have spent tonight exploring together. Right now, in this exact moment, there is nothing left to do, nothing left to build or carry or manage. There is only this quiet, only this darkness, only the particular universal relief of a day finally, completely finished. Let your own body settle now the way both these women's bodies settled, whatever labor or worry your own day carried, however far removed your own comfortable evening might be from either the cottage's hard exhaustion or the manor's carefully managed rest. You do not need to build a fire in the dark tomorrow morning. You do not need to carry water or spin thread or manage a household's careful accounts. You simply need to rest right now in this quiet moment and let whatever this particular day asked of you finally, gently, release its hold. Sleep well, my friend. We have walked through some genuinely hidden houses together tonight, cottage and manor alike, and I hope wherever you are lying as these words finally reach their end, that you carry a little of that world's quiet, hard-won comfort into your own rest now. The hearth is banked, the candle is nearly spent, the whole house, whichever house you might have imagined yourself standing inside tonight, has finally gone still and dark and warm enough to hold you through until morning. Rest now. I will be here again next time whenever you are ready to step back into another world together. Until then, sleep well.